Hello everyone, I am the Crime Teller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. Miguel El Fantasma. Rivera never officially existed. No birth records, no formal education history, no medical documents, just whispers in the underground world of drug trafficking and human smuggling across America. His name alone evoked fear among those who knew of his operations, a vast and intricate empire that stretched from the US-Mexico border to the furthest corners of the east and west coasts. Unlike traditional cartel bosses who flaunted wealth with luxury cars and fortified mansions, Rivera chose to remain unseen. He was not just another trafficker. He understood the loopholes in the system, the blind spots in law enforcement, and the art of operating from the shadows. He never stayed in one place for too long, using forged identities, communicating only through trusted intermediaries, and orchestrating one of the most elusive and extensive criminal networks in modern American history. Rivera's rise to power began in the early 2010s. Initially, he was a small player, transporting cocaine and heroin through hidden desert trails along the Texas and California borders. But as cartel violence escalated and rivals were eliminated, he seized the opportunity to take control. He diversified his business, expanding into human smuggling, a trade just as lucrative, if not more, than narcotics. His methods were cruelly efficient. Desperate migrants from Central and South America were promised safe passage into the U.S., provided they paid hefty fees to his agents. Many believed they were buying freedom, but instead, they were sold into forced labor in sweatshops, agricultural fields, and, in the worst cases, underground brothels. At the same time, his drug trafficking operation flooded American cities with deadly substances. Unlike traditional cartels that relied on massive shipments in cargo trucks or fishing vessels, Rivera's network exploited the very backbone of modern commerce, commercial logistics companies. Hidden compartments in delivery vans, private aircraft loaded with contraband, and even unsuspecting corporate supply chains carried his product into the streets of Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and Miami. But Rivera's true power lay in his ability to infiltrate institutions meant to stop him. Corrupt officials were on his payroll, from customs officers at border checkpoints to law enforcement officers in major cities. Some looked the other way for cash, while others actively aided his operations. With every bribe, every silenced informant, and every rigged shipment, his empire grew stronger. However, no criminal network lasts forever. The beginning of his downfall came not from a dramatic shootout or a high-speed chase, but from a single mistake, a phone left unlocked. In 2018, a low-level courier was arrested in Arizona with a phone containing encrypted messages linking back to Rivera's organization. Federal agencies pounced, tracing financial transactions, identifying patterns in smuggling routes, and slowly dismantling his network. It took more than a year of surveillance, intercepted communications, and sting operations, but law enforcement finally had a lead strong enough to follow. Rivera, once a ghost, now had a trail. The manhunt for him became one of the largest federal operations in recent history, involving the DEA, FBI, and even Interpol. One by one, his safe houses were discovered, his intermediaries arrested, and his carefully constructed layers of secrecy peeled away. As his empire crumbled, Rivera found himself running out of options, allies, and, most importantly, places to hide. In 2019, it all came to an end in an unexpected place. Not in a remote jungle or an underground bunker filled with cash, but in a quiet, rundown home in a small Florida town. When SWAT officers stormed the residence, they didn't find the legendary crime lord they had feared for years. Instead, they found a frail, exhausted man who had lost everything. His capture marked the end of an era, but the damage he inflicted remained. Thousands of trafficking victims were still lost in the shadows of the system. Families continued mourning loved ones lost to addiction, and the remnants of his illicit fortune still circulated through the black market. Rivera's fall was just a chapter in a larger, ongoing story, one that proved that even the most powerful criminals can be caught, but their influence lingers long after they're gone. And though Rivera would spend the rest of his life behind bars, those who once worked for him, who knew his methods, and who had seen his power firsthand, understood one terrifying truth. For every ghost that disappears, another is waiting to take its place. Miguel El Fantasma, Rivera sat in a windowless interrogation room, his wrists shackled to the steel table. The years of running had caught up to him. His once sharp eyes, known for their piercing coldness, were now bloodshot and sunken. His skin, tanned by years of traveling through the scorching deserts and humid jungles of the Americas, was pale under the artificial light. The man who had terrorized law enforcement agencies for over a decade had been reduced to a hollow shell. But his story, the true depth of his crimes, was just beginning to unravel. As the agents prepared to question him, Rivera remained silent. He knew how this worked. He had spent years bribing, threatening, and eliminating anyone who dared to cross him. He had built a web so complex that even if he was caught, his empire would continue without him. But for the first time in his life, the control he had always held was slipping through his fingers. The operation to bring down Rivera had not been easy. It took years of painstaking work, undercover infiltrations, and high-risk surveillance. Law enforcement agencies had followed the money trails, intercepted shipments, and flipped key members of his network. Each step brought them closer to him, but Rivera was always one step ahead, until now. To understand the depth of his crimes, one had to go back to where it all began. Rivera was born in Sinaloa, Mexico, in the late 1970s. His childhood was marked by violence, poverty, and the ever-present influence of the cartels. He was just a teenager when he was recruited into the drug trade, starting as a low-level mule carrying small quantities of heroin across the border. But unlike others who were content with their role, Rivera had bigger ambitions. He studied the trade, learning from the mistakes of those before him. He saw how leaders fell because they trusted the wrong people or grew too arrogant. He realized that violence, while effective, often drew too much attention. The real power lay in invisibility. By the early 2000s, Rivera had transformed himself into the perfect ghost. He had no permanent residence, no social security number, and no digital footprint. Every transaction he made was done through intermediaries, and he communicated only through heavily encrypted channels. His operations stretched far beyond narcotics. He expanded into human smuggling, using the desperation of migrants as a lucrative business opportunity. He offered people a way into the United States, promising them safety and a better life. But once they were in his hands, they became his property. Women and children were sold into trafficking rings, men were forced into labor, and those who refused to comply were never seen again. Rivera's network was so vast that even law enforcement struggled to determine the full extent of his reach. The numbers were staggering. In just a few years, Rivera had smuggled tens of thousands of people into the U.S., generating billions of dollars in revenue. Unlike traditional smugglers who abandoned their cargo at the border, Rivera's network ensured that every person remained profitable long after they crossed into the country. In the fields of California, undocumented workers picked fruit under brutal conditions, their wages siphoned by Rivera's enforcers. In hidden brothels across major cities, victims of his trafficking rings were forced into unimaginable situations. And in underground factories, men worked 18-hour shifts for little to no pay, manufacturing counterfeit goods that were sold in markets around the world. The drugs only made things worse. Rivera didn't just smuggle cocaine and heroin. He was among the first to recognize the potential of fentanyl. Imported from China, synthesized in clandestine labs, and laced into everything from painkillers to party drugs, fentanyl became his golden ticket. It was cheap to produce, highly addictive, and deadly in small doses. By the late 2010s, overdose deaths in America had skyrocketed, with Rivera's product fueling the crisis. Hospitals were overwhelmed with cases of fentanyl poisoning, and law enforcement struggled to contain the flood of illicit substances entering the country. Yet, despite their efforts, Rivera remained untouchable. Rivera's secret weapon was his ability to stay ahead of the law. He had informants embedded in government agencies, border patrol units, and even anti-narcotics task forces. Every major bust that should have crippled his network only resulted in minor losses, because Rivera always knew when to move his operations. His distribution channels were unlike anything law enforcement had seen before. He used legitimate businesses to move his products, shipping companies, warehouses, even commercial airlines. Drugs and trafficking victims were hidden in plain sight, transported across state lines in ways that made them nearly impossible to detect. At the same time, he invested heavily in offshore accounts, real estate, and cryptocurrency. Money laundering was an art he had perfected, funneling billions through a complex web of shell companies and front businesses. Even when authorities seized assets, they found that most of Rivera's wealth remained beyond their reach. But for all his caution, Rivera made one fatal mistake. He trusted the wrong person. In 2018, one of Rivera's most trusted lieutenants, a man named Hector Valdez, was arrested in Texas. Unlike others who had been caught before him, Valdez didn't stay silent. He had grown tired of Rivera's increasing paranoia, of the constant risk, and most importantly, he wanted out. Under federal protection, Valdez turned informant. He provided intelligence on Rivera's operations, locations of warehouses, names of corrupt officials, details of drug shipments. The information was enough to dismantle key parts of Rivera's empire, but more importantly, it gave law enforcement something they had never had before, a direct link to Rivera himself. The net tightened around him. His safe houses were raided, his bank accounts frozen, and his most trusted allies arrested. For the first time, Rivera was running, not from his enemies, but from the law. His final days as a free man were marked by desperation. He moved from one hideout to another, changing his appearance, using fake passports, and desperately trying to salvage what was left of his empire. But it was too late. On a quiet evening in 2019, Rivera was finally cornered in Florida. When the SWAT team breached his hideout, they didn't find a man ready to fight. They found a broken figure, exhausted and defeated, sitting in the dark. The ghost had finally been caught. But even as Rivera was led away in handcuffs, law enforcement knew that the battle was far from over. His network, though severely weakened, still had roots in the underworld. The drugs, the trafficking, the corruption, it wouldn't disappear overnight. And for every kingpin that fell, another was waiting to take his place. Rivera sat in a high-security federal prison, his empire dismantled, but far from destroyed. The media had turned his arrest into a spectacle, painting him as the mastermind behind one of the most intricate criminal networks in modern history. Journalists scrambled for interviews, former allies disappeared into the shadows, and law enforcement paraded his capture as a victory in the war on drugs and human trafficking. But Rivera knew better. He had spent decades preparing for every possibility, including his own downfall. The very structure of his organization ensured that no single arrest, not even his own, would bring it all crashing down. He had trained lieutenants to act independently, instructed money launderers to keep funds beyond the reach of authorities, and set contingency plans in motion long before the law closed in on him. Even as he sat in his cell, the wheels of his empire continued to turn. The key to Rivera's resilience lay in his approach to crime. He had always treated it as a business, not a power struggle. While other cartel leaders engaged in bloody turf wars, Rivera had maintained a low profile, ensuring that his operations remained intact even as his competitors were taken down. He had infiltrated corporate supply chains, using legitimate shipping companies to transport illicit goods under layers of legal protection. He had bought politicians, ensuring that key legislation remained in his favor. His trafficking network extended far beyond the U.S.-Mexico border. Rivera had deep connections in China, where synthetic opioids were manufactured and shipped worldwide. His operations spanned across South America, where coca plantations thrived under his financial backing. He even had allies in Eastern Europe, where human trafficking rings provided him with a steady supply of victims. Law enforcement had underestimated him for years, believing that taking down individual shipments or mid-level operators would weaken his reach. But Rivera's power had never rested in any one aspect of his business. It was in his ability to adapt. Now, with his arrest, the real question remained: who would take his place? In Rivera's absence, a void formed at the top of his empire. Unlike traditional cartels, his organization did not have a clear chain of succession. It was structured in a way that allowed multiple factions to operate semi-independently, each controlling different aspects of the business. Three key figures emerged from the chaos. Raul El Cirujano Morales, a former doctor-turned-cartel chemist, who had been responsible for refining fentanyl production and developing new drug formulas that evaded law enforcement detection. Isabella La Dama de la Noche Vega, an expert in human trafficking who had built a network that spanned from Central America to Europe. She specialized in moving people undetected, leveraging both legal and illegal immigration systems. Victor El Ciego Salazar, Rivera's most trusted enforcer, who had overseen the distribution of narcotics across North America. He had built strong alliances with biker gangs, prison networks, and local street gangs to ensure Rivera's products remained dominant in the market. With Rivera behind bars, these three figures saw an opportunity, not to replace him, but to divide his empire among themselves. But they weren't the only ones watching. The U.S. government, now emboldened by Rivera's capture, intensified its crackdown on the remnants of his organization. Task forces were created to dismantle what remained, targeting key distribution hubs and corrupt officials who had facilitated his operations for years. International agencies joined the fight, with Chinese authorities cracking down on fentanyl production, European law enforcement disrupting trafficking routes, and South American governments seizing cocaine shipments linked to Rivera's network. But even as law enforcement celebrated their victories, the reality on the ground remained grim. New traffickers emerged to fill the demand. Synthetic drugs continued to flood the streets. Migrants seeking a better life still fell into the hands of traffickers. And the black market economy, which had made Rivera one of the most powerful criminals in the world, remained stronger than ever. The war was far from over. Rivera's trial became one of the most closely watched legal battles in modern history. Prosecutors sought multiple life sentences, arguing that his crimes had resulted in thousands of deaths and untold suffering. Witnesses, including former associates, trafficking victims, and DEA agents, testified against him. But Rivera remained emotionless. He listened as his life was dissected in court, as the media painted him as the villain of the century. He knew how this would end. There would be no plea deal, no escape. Yet, even as the judge delivered his verdict, life without parole, Rivera felt no regret. Because he knew the truth, as long as there was demand, someone would always supply. And the cycle would continue. The courtroom had been filled with whispers, the air thick with the anticipation of a historic conviction. Rivera, clad in a dark suit that no longer fit his once imposing frame, remained impassive as the final verdict was read aloud. The gavel struck, sealing his fate, life in a maximum security prison without the possibility of parole. For the world, his downfall was a moment of triumph, a symbol of justice prevailing against the forces of crime. News outlets declared it the end of an era, the collapse of one of the most elusive drug and human trafficking syndicates in history. But Rivera knew the truth. His imprisonment was nothing more than a change of scenery. The machine he had built, a network that had taken decades to perfect, would not crumble overnight. Too many people had too much to lose. The empire he had nurtured did not depend on his freedom. It thrived on the carefully placed layers of power, the decentralized web of influence he had orchestrated from the very beginning. As Rivera was escorted out of the courtroom, his hands shackled but his mind as sharp as ever, he allowed himself a small, knowing smile. Because somewhere, in the very heart of his empire, the real work was only just beginning. With Rivera locked away, the criminal underworld braced for the inevitable power shift. Unlike the chaotic collapses seen in other cartel takedowns, where violence erupted between warring factions, Rivera's network had been built differently. He had ensured that power was not consolidated in any one place. Instead, his subordinates functioned as independent operatives, each specializing in a specific trade: narcotics, money laundering, human trafficking, weapons distribution, and political corruption. This division was not just a tactical choice, it was a necessity. By operating in compartments, no single arrest could dismantle the entire system. And now, with Rivera out of the picture, his lieutenants saw an opportunity. Raul El Cirujano Morales had already begun ramping up synthetic opioid production, testing a new formula that was even more potent than fentanyl. Laboratories hidden deep in Mexico's cartel-controlled territories continued to produce shipments that would flood American cities within weeks. Isabella La Dama de la Noche Vega was expanding her trafficking network, taking advantage of loopholes in immigration policies to move people undetected. Her operations had gone beyond Central America. She now had direct routes from Eastern Europe, Africa, and even Southeast Asia, exploiting war zones and economic collapses to recruit vulnerable individuals. Victor El Ciego Salazar, ever the opportunist, brokered new deals with international smuggling syndicates, ensuring that Rivera's narcotics empire continued uninterrupted. Using encrypted messaging networks and offshore shell companies, he funneled millions through real estate and crypto transactions, ensuring that money moved faster than the authorities could track. With each passing day, Rivera's lieutenants grew bolder. Each of them had something to prove. Each of them hungered for control. And while their former leader sat behind bars, they were not about to let his legacy die. Rivera understood that even from inside a maximum security prison, his voice carried weight. He had spent years ingraining loyalty into his subordinates, ensuring that those who worked for him knew one simple truth: he was never truly out of the game. Guards monitored his every move, but Rivera had never needed to speak directly to give orders. He had spent years perfecting the art of coded communication. A book left on a prison library shelf, a message embedded in a legal document, a single phrase uttered in a phone call monitored by authorities who couldn't decipher its real meaning. With these methods, Rivera continued to pull the strings. He orchestrated diversions, leaking false information to law enforcement that led to the arrests of smaller, rival factions, all while keeping his own people safe. He fed journalists manufactured stories, creating chaos in the media that distracted from real cartel movements. He even managed to coordinate violent crackdowns on former allies who had grown too ambitious, reminding his organization that, even from a cage, he was still the one in control. Rivera was no fool. He knew his time as a free man was over, but that did not mean the empire he built had to fall. If anything, his capture had only strengthened its myth. The U.S. government had anticipated a total collapse of Rivera's empire following his arrest. Instead, they watched in horror as drug overdoses skyrocketed, human trafficking routes expanded, and organized crime adapted faster than law enforcement could react. With Rivera behind bars, there was no singular enemy to target. Instead, authorities found themselves fighting a shadow war, facing an organization that no longer relied on one man, but rather, a system that had evolved to survive without him. Every time a trafficking ring was shut down, another one emerged in its place. Every time a shipment was seized, another made it through unnoticed. Rivera had created something that no government agency had been prepared for, a criminal enterprise so decentralized, so embedded in legitimate business structures, that even its most powerful figurehead being captured had little effect. And that was what terrified law enforcement the most. They had won a battle, but the war? It was far from over. Locked away in a cell that would be his home for the rest of his life, Rivera pondered his final play. He was getting older. He knew that, eventually, even his influence would wane. So he did what he had always done best. He planned for the future. Rivera had spent years ensuring that his wealth was untouchable, hidden in offshore accounts, cryptocurrency wallets, and legitimate corporate investments that no government could trace back to him. He had lawyers, accountants, and financial strategists who had never set foot in the underworld, but worked tirelessly to keep his fortune secure. And now he would pass it down. A new generation would inherit his empire, not just as former lieutenants, but a carefully chosen successor who could evolve his business beyond anything he had ever dreamed. Rivera understood one thing better than anyone. Crime wasn't about power, it was about patience, and he had all the time in the world. As Rivera sat in his cell, the air thick with the scent of iron bars and stale sweat, he knew that time was slipping away from him. Not in the way it did for most prisoners, the ones who counted the days, scratching marks into the walls, hoping for a parole that would never come. No, for Rivera, time was slipping in a different way. The empire he had built was evolving, changing hands, and soon it might outgrow him. But he had one last card to play. Far beyond the walls of his confinement, his influence remained. It did not rely on whispered orders or coded messages anymore. It had taken root in the very fabric of global commerce, hidden behind layers of legitimacy. While authorities chased ghosts in the drug trade and human smuggling rings, they failed to see where Rivera had truly invested his future. Because his greatest crime was not the drugs. It was the system he had corrupted from the inside out. Long before his arrest, Rivera had understood that brute force and violence could only take him so far. The cartels that ruled with bullets and intimidation always collapsed under their own weight, either betrayed from within or dismantled by governments that grew tired of their existence. He had no intention of following that path. So he invested in silence. He built shell companies, real estate firms, shipping conglomerates, investment portfolios that laundered billions under the guise of legitimate business. He partnered with people who wore tailored suits instead of tattoos, men and women who had never touched a gun but knew how to move money across borders without a trace. And most importantly, he made himself indispensable. Even after his arrest, the foundations of major industries were still tied to his network. Pharmaceutical companies, whose raw materials had been sourced through his supply chains, still depended on his hidden factories in South America. Private security firms, unknowingly funded with cartel money, continued to operate in war-torn regions, protecting assets Rivera had long since abandoned. And then there was the digital frontier, a world that law enforcement still struggled to regulate. Rivera had moved beyond offshore banks and numbered accounts. His true wealth existed in encrypted ledgers, decentralized financial systems, and investments that no government could seize. They had locked him away, thinking they had won. But in doing so, they had left his real empire untouched. Rivera's greatest strength had always been his ability to see the future. He knew that no empire, criminal or otherwise, could survive without succession. His lieutenants were powerful, yes, but they were too short-sighted, focused on their own wealth and influence. They were not the ones who would carry his legacy forward. For that, he had chosen someone else. Someone no one saw coming. Deep within the ranks of his empire, Rivera had cultivated a different kind of heir, a mind that understood not just crime, but systems, technology, and the evolving landscape of power. A child of the digital age, someone who could move resources with a few keystrokes, hide operations behind legitimate enterprises, and manipulate global economies with the same ease that Rivera had once moved product across borders. They were not a soldier, not a trafficker, not a killer, but they were more dangerous than all of them combined. As law enforcement scrambled to contain what they believed was a crumbling empire, something new was rising in its place. The streets were still flooded with drugs, but the distribution was changing, moving into encrypted marketplaces impossible to track. The trafficking networks still thrived, but they no longer relied on physical crossings. False identities, digital manipulation, and AI-driven smuggling routes now dictated the movement of people across continents. The money still flowed, but it was no longer just stacks of cash in cartel vaults. It was embedded in global commerce, woven so deeply into financial institutions that unraveling it would mean bringing down legitimate corporations in the process. Rivera had always known this day would come. Crime, like everything else, had to evolve, and the world had made one fatal mistake. They thought his empire was built on him. It wasn't. It was built on an idea, and ideas never die. Rivera no longer had to give orders. He had designed his empire to function without him. The real power wasn't in the cartel enforcers, the money launderers, or the traffickers moving shipments across borders. It was in the invisible web he had woven, an empire built on technology, finance, and a world addicted to its own vices. Even as he sat in prison, forgotten by the media and dismissed as just another cartel boss taken down, the system he had created continued to grow. The brilliance of his operation wasn't in how much money he had made. It was in how deeply his network had infiltrated legitimate global structures. They had taken away his name, but they had failed to erase his influence. Most multinational companies had no idea they were funding Rivera's empire. Shipping conglomerates unknowingly transported goods laced with fentanyl, disguised as medical supplies. Investment firms held shares in legitimate businesses controlled by Rivera's network, funneling billions into his system without ever realizing it. Even humanitarian organizations, desperate for funding, had accepted donations from fronts he had set up years ago, turning dirty money into clean goodwill. The most ironic part? Some of the same politicians who had pushed for Rivera's imprisonment had unknowingly signed deals with subsidiaries of his own empire. His reach was not just criminal, it was systemic. While law enforcement agencies focused on busting traditional drug routes, Rivera's real operation had already moved on. Instead of shipping kilos of cocaine through overland routes, his network had adapted. 3D printed drugs, synthetic opioids designed at the molecular level to evade regulations, and encrypted darknet marketplaces now handled transactions that no border patrol could stop. Instead of using human traffickers to physically move people across borders, Rivera's network had hacked into immigration systems, creating identities that made their clients appear as legitimate travelers. Instead of suitcases full of cartel money being flown overseas, funds were now moved through decentralized finance platforms, stored in crypto wallets that authorities couldn't trace. And every new law, restriction, or crackdown that governments imposed, Rivera's successors used it against them, turning regulations into loopholes, using the blind spots in legal systems to make their operation more untouchable than ever before. From his prison cell, Rivera still had access to one thing: patience. He did not need to rush. He knew that the world outside was shifting in his favor. Governments were distracted. The world economy was fragile. Corruption had only grown deeper. And his empire? It no longer needed his face, his voice, or even his name. It had become self-sustaining, a machine too vast, too embedded into the fabric of society to be stopped. They had imprisoned the man, but the ghost of his empire still ruled the world. And it always would. Case 2. Javier El Fantasma Morales had always been a ghost in the world of crime. No official records tied him to any country, no fingerprints, no photographs, nothing concrete. His name echoed in hushed whispers among law enforcement agencies across the Americas, yet few had seen him in person. Those who had, traffickers, mercenaries, corrupt officials, either vanished or remained silent, terrified of the consequences. For nearly 2 decades, Morales had built an empire stretching from the jungles of Colombia to the bustling ports of Los Angeles. His network was unlike anything law enforcement had encountered before, a seamless operation blending drug cartels, human trafficking rings, and sophisticated financial laundering systems. Unlike traditional cartel leaders, Morales had never operated with brute force alone. He was a strategist, an economist of crime, a master of logistics who understood that the world's most valuable commodity was not drugs or guns, but people. His organization, known only by its internal code, Operación Nocturna, moved thousands of trafficked individuals yearly, funneling them from the southernmost borders of Latin America to the sprawling cities of the United States. Some were desperate migrants who had willingly entered his network, promised safe passage in exchange for hefty fees. Others were kidnapped, their fates sealed the moment they were taken. Many were women and children, forced into servitude under the guise of employment. Drugs were merely a byproduct of his real business. The same routes used to smuggle people were also pipelines for heroin, fentanyl, and methamphetamine, ensuring that Morales profited from both the demand for narcotics and the desperation of those seeking a better life. By the early 2010s, his reach had become almost untouchable. He had infiltrated law enforcement agencies, port authorities, and even political circles. His network extended deep into the digital underworld, utilizing encrypted messaging services, cryptocurrencies, and shell corporations spanning multiple continents. Even as the United States ramped up its war on drugs, Morales thrived, slipping through the cracks like smoke. What made his operations so effective was their meticulous structure. His network functioned on a cellular system, ensuring that even if a part of the chain was compromised, the whole remained intact. Each shipment, whether of drugs or people, was disguised through legitimate businesses, trucking companies, fishing enterprises, even humanitarian aid organizations. While most cartels relied on violent enforcement, Morales preferred control through debt. Those who crossed him didn't face immediate execution. Instead, their families were placed under financial and psychological strangleholds. The fear of losing loved ones, of being trapped in an endless cycle of servitude, was more powerful than any bullet. For years, he operated with impunity, always staying one step ahead of authorities. But as his empire grew, so did the attention on his organization. Law enforcement agencies across the Americas, from the DEA to Interpol, had been gathering intelligence, piecing together the fragments of a vast, invisible machine. It was in early 2016 that a breakthrough finally emerged. A low-level operative, arrested in Miami, provided a crucial lead: a series of offshore bank transactions linked to a seemingly innocuous agricultural company in Mexico. Digging deeper, investigators found evidence connecting it to over 100 shell corporations across the Caribbean, Asia, and Europe. These companies were the financial arteries of Morales' empire, pumping billions of dollars into legitimate-looking investments. The next clue came from an intercepted shipment in Texas, falsely declared medical supplies but containing hidden compartments filled with fentanyl. But what made this bust different wasn't just the drugs. It was a coded manifest found within the truck. Upon decryption, authorities uncovered something far more disturbing: a ledger detailing human cargo, names, ages, destinations. The scale of the operation was staggering. Over the years, tens of thousands of individuals had been trafficked through Morales' network. Some were forced into labor, others into illicit industries, and many simply disappeared, their fates unknown. Despite the mounting evidence, Morales himself remained elusive. He never stayed in one place for long, constantly shifting between safe houses in South America, Europe, and Asia. His last known sighting had been in a luxury resort in Dubai, where he had met with influential businessmen who, knowingly or not, were complicit in laundering his fortune. What finally led to his downfall wasn't a dramatic shootout or a daring raid, but a financial loophole, an unnoticed discrepancy in cryptocurrency transactions that traced back to a high-ranking banker in Switzerland. A coordinated operation spanning multiple countries was launched, targeting Morales' financial backbone. By mid-2017, his assets were frozen, warehouses were raided, traffickers arrested, and safe houses dismantled. His empire began to collapse from within as trusted associates turned against him, seeking deals to save themselves. Then, in an unexpected turn, Morales made his first and only mistake. Cornered, desperate to escape, he attempted to flee to Russia, seeking asylum through connections in the underground market. But an informant within his own circle tipped off authorities. On a cold morning in December 2017, a private jet carrying Morales landed in Istanbul for refueling. As soon as he stepped off the plane, Turkish authorities, working in collaboration with the US and Interpol, moved in. Within minutes, the ghost of the criminal underworld was finally in custody. His trial was one of the most publicized in history. The testimonies of victims, the staggering amount of evidence, and the sheer scale of his operation shocked the world. Governments scrambled to address the failures that had allowed such an empire to thrive. Morales, facing multiple life sentences, never spoke during his trial. Some believed he still held secrets, names, accounts, hidden reserves of wealth. Others speculated he had always planned for his own capture, ensuring that the remnants of his organization could survive without him. But the truth was simpler. Even ghosts, no matter how elusive, could eventually be caught. And in the end, the empire he had built in shadows was dismantled, brick by brick, until all that remained was a cautionary tale of greed, power, and the hidden corridors of global crime. The arrest of Javier, El Fantasma, Morales sent shockwaves across the criminal underworld. For decades, he had been an untouchable force, a name spoken in hushed tones by both law enforcement and the traffickers who worked under him. His capture was not just a victory for justice, it was a seismic shift in the balance of power. In the weeks following his arrest, law enforcement agencies across multiple continents scrambled to piece together the remnants of his vast criminal empire. While Morales had been the mastermind, the network he had built was designed to function without him. Cells operated independently, routes were established across the globe, and countless individuals were still trapped within the shadowy corridors of his operation. The first challenge authorities faced was unraveling the intricate financial web he had woven over decades. Morales' money was not kept in simple offshore accounts or hidden safes. It was buried within complex layers of corporate fronts, cryptocurrency wallets, and real estate investments that stretched from Hong Kong to the Cayman Islands. His fortune was estimated to be in the billions, and every dollar was meticulously laundered through legitimate businesses. Investigators traced his funds through high-end art sales, diamond smuggling rings, and shell companies that owned luxury hotels and shipping conglomerates. In many cases, the individuals running these businesses had no idea they were working for a criminal syndicate. Morales' genius lay in his ability to create distance between himself and the illegal operations he controlled. But the money was only one part of the puzzle. The more urgent concern was the people. Across Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe, thousands of individuals remained in transit, trapped within the machinery of Morales' syndicate. Many had been promised a better life, only to find themselves forced into labor camps, sweatshops, or even worse. Women and children, in particular, were the most vulnerable. Their fates sealed the moment they were taken from their homes. The most horrifying discoveries came from the tunnels and warehouses scattered along the US-Mexico border. Morales' organization had developed one of the most sophisticated smuggling infrastructures in modern history. Tunnels stretching for miles, equipped with ventilation systems, lighting, and even rail tracks to transport people and contraband with efficiency. Some of these tunnels had been in use for over a decade, unknown to authorities. When law enforcement raided one such tunnel near El Paso, Texas, what they found defied belief. Hidden behind a seemingly abandoned warehouse, the entrance led to a vast underground network where dozens of people were held in makeshift detention rooms. Some had been there for weeks, waiting for their turn to be transported deeper into the United States. Many were malnourished, exhausted, and terrified to speak, fearing retaliation from Morales' remaining operatives. Despite his arrest, the syndicate continued to function in fractured pieces. Mid-level operatives scrambled to seize control of territories, leading to a violent power struggle within the criminal underworld. Cartels that had once worked in harmony with Morales now turned on each other, seeking to claim the void he had left behind. One of the most significant battles erupted in the port city of Veracruz, Mexico. Morales had used Veracruz as a primary hub for his operations, moving shipments of drugs and human cargo through hidden compartments in cargo ships. When word spread of his downfall, rival factions descended upon the city, each one desperate to seize control of the lucrative trafficking routes. The result was a wave of violence that left dozens dead, including corrupt officials who had once turned a blind eye to the operations. Authorities, meanwhile, faced an overwhelming challenge. Morales' arrest had been a victory, but dismantling his empire required a level of coordination that had never been seen before. The DEA, FBI, Interpol, and local law enforcement agencies across multiple countries had to work together, sharing intelligence, tracking financial transactions, and shutting down the remnants of his network. What made matters worse was that Morales himself refused to cooperate. Locked away in a maximum security facility, he remained silent, offering no information on his organization. His lawyers, some of the most expensive in the world, attempted to negotiate plea deals, but the sheer weight of the evidence against him left little room for maneuvering. In the absence of his direct testimony, investigators relied on former associates who had been captured in the months following his arrest. One of the most significant informants was a man known only as Rafael, a former lieutenant in Morales' organization. Rafael had been responsible for overseeing the transportation of high-value shipments, both drugs and people, through Central America. After his capture in Guatemala, he agreed to provide information in exchange for protection. What he revealed painted a chilling picture of the true scale of Morales' operations. According to Rafael, Morales had not only infiltrated law enforcement agencies, but had actively recruited officials into his network. Border Patrol officers, customs agents, and even high-ranking politicians had been on his payroll, ensuring that his shipments passed through undetected. Those who refused to cooperate were either blackmailed or eliminated. Rafael also detailed the psychological manipulation used on trafficking victims. Many were kept in constant fear, their families back home threatened with violence if they attempted to escape. Others were brainwashed, told that their only chance of survival was to remain obedient. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation was the existence of training facilities hidden deep in the jungles of Colombia and Honduras. Here, trafficked individuals were conditioned for their new lives, taught how to behave, how to respond to authorities, and even given false identities. Some were forced to memorize fake family histories, ensuring that if questioned, they could pass as legitimate asylum seekers or workers. As these details emerged, the pressure on law enforcement intensified. Raids were conducted across multiple countries, resulting in the arrests of hundreds of individuals connected to the syndicate. But even with these victories, the damage Morales had inflicted could never be fully undone. Entire communities had been devastated by his operations. Families torn apart, young children sold into a life of servitude. Entire towns in Mexico and Central America held hostage by the fear of retaliation. Even in the United States, the impact was felt. Thousands of fentanyl overdoses traced back to Morales' shipments, countless lives lost to the drugs he had flooded into American cities. The trial itself became a global spectacle. Victims came forward to testify, their stories heartbreaking and harrowing. One woman, a survivor from Honduras, recounted how she had been smuggled into the United States with the promise of domestic work, only to find herself trapped in a human trafficking ring. Another victim, a former cartel enforcer, described the brutal punishments inflicted on those who attempted to escape Morales' control. As the prosecution laid out its case, it became clear that Morales would never see freedom again. His crimes spanned decades, his victims numbering in the thousands. The jury took less than 2 hours to deliver their verdict, guilty on all charges. The sentencing was swift. Morales received multiple life sentences, ensuring he would die behind bars. Yet even as he was led away in chains, the fight against his network was far from over. In the aftermath, law enforcement agencies continued their work, tracking down the remnants of his empire. Some of his associates disappeared, retreating into the shadows, while others attempted to rebuild what had been lost. But the era of Javier El Fantasma Morales was over. He had once been a ghost, a legend whispered in the corridors of power and crime. But in the end, even the most untouchable figures could fall. And when he did, the world finally saw the full extent of the darkness he had cast over thousands of lives. The world moved on after Javier El Fantasma Morales was sentenced to multiple life terms, but his shadow remained. His empire had been wounded, its king dethroned, but the tendrils of his operations still snaked through the underworld. The syndicate he built did not crumble overnight. It fractured, reformed, and in some cases, grew more dangerous in its desperation to survive. For the law enforcement officials who had worked tirelessly to bring him down, the battle was far from over. There were still names on the list, cartel lieutenants, corrupt officials, and financiers who had fueled Morales' rise. Some had already been arrested, their faces plastered across news broadcasts, but others had slipped away, vanishing into the lawless regions of South America, Europe, and even Africa. One of those men was Esteban Rojas. Rojas had been Morales' right-hand man, a ghost within a ghost's empire. While Morales was the mastermind, the strategist who built the operation from the ground up, Rojas was the enforcer, the one who ensured loyalty through fear. He was the man who decided who lived and who died, who would be granted a second chance, and who would disappear without a trace. Unlike Morales, who thrived in the shadows, Rojas had no interest in being untouchable. He was ruthless but visible, feared even by those within the organization. While Morales hid behind layers of bureaucracy and corporate fronts, Rojas left his mark in the blood-stained streets of Mexico, Colombia, and Venezuela. When Morales fell, Rojas disappeared. For nearly a year, investigators searched for him, tracking financial transactions, listening to wiretaps, following leads from informants. Some claimed he had fled to Spain, where he had distant relatives. Others believed he had gone underground in Argentina, hiding among the remnants of Morales' network. Then came the massacre in Riohacha, Colombia. It was the kind of violence that could not be ignored. An entire safe house reduced to a pile of bodies, a message scrawled on the wall in blood. El fantasma puede estar muerto, pero nosotros no hemos terminado. The ghost may be dead, but we are not finished. The victims were known associates of Morales, mid-level operators who had been attempting to reorganize the cartel's smuggling routes. Some were shot execution style, others had been tortured before they died. But it was the method, the signature, that caught the attention of investigators. This was Rojas' work. He was still out there, and he was making sure everyone knew it. The DEA, working alongside Interpol and Colombian intelligence, intensified their search. The massacre in Riohacha was not an isolated incident. Similar attacks occurred in Venezuela, Honduras, and even as far north as Guatemala. Rojas was on a warpath, eliminating any loose ends, consolidating power in the absence of Morales. But he was also running out of options. With every body he left behind, he drew more attention. His enemies were watching, his allies questioning their loyalty. The world had changed since Morales' arrest. Law enforcement had more tools, better cooperation between agencies, and a newfound determination to ensure Morales' legacy did not continue. Then came the breakthrough. A wiretap on a suspected cartel financier in Panama revealed a name, Isla Negra. Isla Negra was a private island in the Caribbean, officially owned by a conglomerate specializing in ecotourism. In reality, it had been one of Morales' most secretive operations, a place where high-value shipments were held before being transported to their final destinations. Few outside the highest ranks of the cartel knew of its existence. The financier's conversation suggested that Rojas had retreated there, using it as a fortress while he decided his next move. Within days, a multi-agency task force was mobilized. The United States, Mexico, and Colombia coordinated the operation, deploying elite units trained in counter-narcotics and high-risk apprehensions. A direct assault on the island was considered too dangerous. Rojas had likely fortified his position, and there were hostages to consider. Instead, they launched a precision strike. Under the cover of darkness, Special Forces teams moved in, securing the perimeter and cutting off potential escape routes. Helicopters hovered above, drones providing real-time surveillance. As the teams advanced, they found evidence of Morales' empire still operating, documents, cash, weapons, and most disturbingly, dozens of people being held in captivity. Some were trafficking victims awaiting transport. Others were cartel operatives who had crossed Rojas and were now prisoners. The teams moved quickly, securing the captives, gathering intelligence. But Rojas was nowhere to be found. In the main villa, they discovered his last known location, a room filled with maps, satellite images, and coded messages. He had been planning something big. But he had slipped away once again, always one step ahead. The raid was a success in many ways. Hostages were freed, evidence was gathered, and a major cartel stronghold was dismantled. But the man they had come for, the last piece of Morales' puzzle, remained at large. For the next 6 months, the hunt continued. Leads dried up, then resurfaced in unexpected places. There were whispers of Rojas in Morocco, in Dubai, in the lawless tri-border area of South America. Each tip led to a dead end or a ghost trail, but law enforcement refused to let him fade into obscurity. Then, a year to the day after Morales' sentencing, a body was found in a rundown apartment in Buenos Aires. The scene was brutal, signs of struggle, broken furniture, blood splattered across the walls. The victim had been tortured, his hands bound, his throat slit. But what confirmed his identity was the tattoo. A black serpent coiled around a dagger, the mark of Rojas. The man who had ruled with fear had met his end in the same manner he had inflicted on so many others. But who had done it? Cartel rivals? Former allies? A betrayal from within? The official investigation yielded no clear answers. Some believed Rojas had made too many enemies, that his own men had turned on him. Others suspected law enforcement had used less conventional methods to ensure he would never resurface. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: the last vestige of Morales' empire had been erased. But the fight was never truly over. Even as Morales rotted in a prison cell, even as Rojas lay dead in a foreign city, the cycle continued. New names emerged, new cartels rose from the ashes. The drug trade, the human trafficking networks, the corruption that had enabled them. It was a war with no end. For the agents who had spent years chasing Morales and his empire, there was no celebration, no final victory. There was only the knowledge that, for a time, they had made a difference, and the understanding that, somewhere in the world, another ghost was already waiting to take his place. In the months following the death of Esteban Rojas, the world of organized crime continued to shift, adapt, and in some places grow more dangerous. While Morales and Rojas had been formidable figures, their empire had never relied solely on their leadership. The structure they built, a vast, decentralized web of operatives, financiers, smugglers, and corrupt officials, was designed to survive them. The FBI, DEA, and Interpol had spent years dismantling their operations, tracking their money, and taking down their lieutenants. But despite these victories, the illicit networks they had once controlled did not disappear. They splintered. Some of Morales' former allies saw his downfall as an opportunity, a chance to claim the remnants of his kingdom for themselves. In Mexico, a brutal power struggle erupted between rival factions, leading to a wave of violence that left hundreds dead. Cities that had once been controlled by a single, powerful cartel were now battlegrounds, with splintered groups vying for dominance. Further south, in Colombia and Venezuela, former Morales operatives aligned themselves with other criminal organizations, ensuring that the routes Morales had once dominated remained operational. Drugs continued to flow north, human trafficking operations continued to flourish, and the corruption that had shielded Morales for so long remained intact in many places. For law enforcement agencies, the fall of Morales had been a victory, but it had not been the end of the war. One of the biggest challenges came from the financial networks that had funded Morales' empire. While law enforcement had seized millions in cash and assets, much of the cartel's money had been hidden in offshore accounts, cryptocurrency wallets, and shell companies spanning multiple continents. Morales had been a master at laundering money, using a complex system of legitimate businesses to disguise illicit profits. Even with his arrest, much of that wealth remained untouched, and new players were eager to reclaim it. One of those players was Felipe El Socio Vargas. Vargas had once been Morales' financial architect, the man who ensured that every dollar of cartel revenue was accounted for, laundered, and reinvested. Unlike Rojas, who thrived on fear and violence, Vargas was a businessman. He had never been seen carrying a gun, never been directly linked to a murder, and had always maintained a low profile. But make no mistake, he was just as dangerous. Vargas understood that money was power. While Morales had used brute force to establish dominance, Vargas had operated in boardrooms and luxury hotels, forging connections with politicians, bankers, and corporate executives. He had built a financial empire that stretched from the skyscrapers of New York to the tax havens of the Caribbean, ensuring that Morales' wealth remained untouchable. After Morales' arrest, Vargas had gone into hiding. Law enforcement believed he had fled to Dubai, where he could operate beyond the reach of extradition treaties. From there, he continued to manage what remained of Morales' financial empire, ensuring that the cartel's money flowed freely. But Vargas had bigger ambitions. He had never been content working in Morales' shadow. Now that Morales was gone, Vargas saw an opportunity to reshape the underworld in his own image. Not as a drug kingpin, but as a legitimate power broker, a man who could wield influence from behind a veil of respectability. Unlike Rojas, who had died trying to hold on to the past, Vargas looked to the future. He began moving the cartel's operations away from traditional drug smuggling and toward more sophisticated crimes: cyber fraud, financial manipulation, and high-level corruption. His plan was simple. Instead of fighting law enforcement, he would own them. And in many ways, he already did. Through layers of shell companies and offshore accounts, Vargas controlled billions in assets, real estate, shipping companies, private security firms, and even investment funds that quietly funneled cartel money into legitimate businesses. To the outside world, he was just another wealthy investor, a man who hosted charity events and rubbed shoulders with politicians. But behind the scenes, he was consolidating power, ensuring that the empire Morales had built would never truly fall. Law enforcement agencies knew that Vargas was their next target, but he was unlike any criminal they had ever pursued. There were no wiretaps to expose his dealings, no violent crimes to tie him to. He was careful, calculated, and always 3 steps ahead. Then came the Panama Papers leak, a massive trove of documents detailing offshore financial dealings, exposing corrupt officials, corporate fraud, and hidden cartel money. Among the names buried deep in the files was Felipe Vargas. The leak provided the first real evidence linking Vargas to Morales' empire. Investigators now had a trail to follow: transactions, business partnerships, and a web of illicit dealings that stretched across the globe. But exposing Vargas would not be easy. Unlike Morales, who had built his power through intimidation, Vargas had built his through relationships. He had powerful friends in governments, banks, and corporations, and he would not go down without a fight. In Washington, a special task force was formed to take him down, an elite unit comprised of financial crime specialists, cyber investigators, and intelligence analysts. Their mission: unravel Vargas' financial network, expose his dealings, and bring him to justice. But Vargas had already anticipated their moves. Before law enforcement could act, key witnesses disappeared, bank accounts were emptied, and critical evidence vanished. It was as if someone had warned him. And that was when investigators realized the full extent of his influence. Vargas did not just control cartel money, he controlled people. Politicians, judges, high-ranking officials. The kind of power that could silence investigations before they even began. For every lead the task force uncovered, Vargas was already ahead, using his wealth and influence to stay untouchable. Then came the assassinations. One by one, individuals tied to the investigation began dying under mysterious circumstances. A forensic accountant in Miami found dead in his apartment. A financial analyst in London killed in a supposed robbery. A journalist in Mexico City, who had been working on a story about Vargas, gunned down in broad daylight. The message was clear: Vargas was untouchable. But law enforcement refused to back down. They changed tactics, abandoning traditional investigative methods in favor of deep cover operations, cyber infiltration, and the use of informants within Vargas' own network. It was dangerous, high-risk work, but it was the only way to bring him down. As investigators closed in, Vargas made a desperate move. He attempted to buy his way into full legitimacy, using his vast wealth to secure political asylum in a country with no extradition treaties. For a time, it seemed like he would succeed. Then came the unexpected betrayal. One of his closest associates, a former cartel lawyer turned informant, provided law enforcement with the final piece of evidence they needed: direct proof linking Vargas to human trafficking and large-scale drug operations. It was enough to bring him down. In a coordinated international effort, Vargas was arrested in a private jet attempting to flee to Russia. His capture sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld, signaling the end of an era. But the war was far from over. As Vargas sat in a high-security prison awaiting trial, a new generation of criminals rose to take his place. The empire Morales had built had been dismantled, but the system that allowed it to thrive remained. And somewhere in the world, another kingpin was already waiting in the shadows, ready to rise. Vargas' arrest sent tremors through the underworld, but his capture was only the beginning of an even greater storm. Unlike Morales, who had built his empire through violence, Vargas had structured his operations in such a way that removing him wouldn't collapse the entire system. His arrest was a high-profile victory, but behind the scenes, the power vacuum he left behind set off a chain reaction. Money still flowed, deals were still being made, and those who had once relied on Vargas for protection knew they had to act quickly. If they waited too long, they too would be caught in the tightening grip of law enforcement. The Black Ledger, a secret financial record containing the names of Vargas' high-profile clients, corrupt officials, and politicians, became the most sought-after document in the world. It had been his insurance policy, a safeguard against betrayal. But with Vargas in custody, it was now a ticking time bomb. Some believed it had been seized by law enforcement, buried deep within classified files. Others whispered that it had never been found, that Vargas had hidden it away before his arrest. A few even claimed it was in the hands of someone else, someone waiting for the perfect moment to use it as leverage. Whoever held the ledger held power, and in the shadows, a silent war had begun. Weeks after Vargas' capture, U.S. federal prosecutor Daniel Henshaw, the man leading the case against him, disappeared without a trace. Henshaw had been the one pushing for Vargas' trial to be expedited. He had spent years tracking cartel money, and with Vargas in custody, he was preparing what was supposed to be an ironclad case. Then one morning, he simply vanished. His car was found abandoned on a quiet road outside Washington, D.C., engine still running. His phone was left on the passenger seat, with no sign of a struggle. There were no calls, no warnings, nothing. One day, he was building a case. The next, he was gone. The implications were clear. Someone had gotten to him. The FBI launched an immediate investigation, but every lead came to a dead end. Security footage near his last known location had been tampered with. Witnesses reported seeing nothing unusual. His family received no ransom demands, no threats, just silence. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. Henshaw had been the key to ensuring Vargas' conviction. Without him, the case could stall. Evidence could go missing. Witnesses could recant their testimonies out of fear. And most importantly, the ledger, if it existed, might never be found. The message was chilling. If they could reach Henshaw, they could reach anyone. As authorities scrambled to salvage the case, a new player emerged from the shadows. They were known only as the Ghost Syndicate, a nameless, faceless organization that seemed to operate outside traditional cartel structures. Unlike Morales' empire, which had relied on drug smuggling and violence, the Ghost Syndicate was something else entirely. They were invisible. There were no known leaders, no identifiable figureheads. They didn't leave bodies in the streets or make dramatic public displays. Instead, they operated through silence, through whispers. Their influence stretched across government agencies, financial institutions, and law enforcement itself. It was as if Vargas' fall had not weakened the cartel world, but strengthened it in a way that no one had anticipated. Some believed the Ghost Syndicate was a coalition of Vargas' former associates, stepping in to fill the void. Others thought it was something much worse, an entirely new entity, one that had existed in the background for years, waiting for its moment. One thing was certain, they were watching. Every time law enforcement got close to uncovering something, it was erased. Documents disappeared. Bank accounts were wiped clean. Informants died under mysterious circumstances. It was as if they knew every move before it happened. And then came the first real warning. One of the FBI agents leading the investigation received an untraceable message. "Stop looking, or you'll end up like Henshaw." It was a sign that the battle had changed. Vargas was behind bars, but the war he had helped start was far from over. While law enforcement was losing ground, one person refused to let the story die. Investigative journalist Elena Vasquez had been following the Vargas case for years. She had seen cartel wars, corrupt politicians, and criminal empires rise and fall. But this was different. She didn't believe Henshaw had simply vanished. She believed someone had made him disappear. And more importantly, she believed that the Black Ledger held the answers. If she could find it, she could expose everything. Her investigation took her from the streets of Mexico City to the corporate offices of Miami, where shell companies had been set up to launder Vargas money. She spoke to former cartel insiders, hackers, even ex-law enforcement officers who had been silenced or forced into retirement. What she discovered was more terrifying than she had imagined. The Black Ledger was real, and it was no longer in Vargas' hands. Someone else had taken it, someone more dangerous. Her sources pointed her to a single name, an alias, whispered among those still in the criminal world. Spectre. No one knew who Spectre was. But if Vargas had been untouchable, Spectre was unstoppable. Elena knew she was close, but she also knew she was running out of time. The closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. Anonymous threats flooded her inbox. Surveillance cameras outside her apartment mysteriously stopped working. Someone had broken into her home, but nothing was stolen, except for a single USB drive containing her notes. Then she got the message. Stop digging. You don't know what you're dealing with. She had a choice, walk away and stay safe, or keep pushing and risk everything. She chose the latter. But as she booked a flight to Dubai, where she believed the final piece of the puzzle lay, She couldn't shake the feeling that she was already being watched. And she was right. As she boarded the plane, a man sitting a few rows behind her made a call. No words were spoken, just silence. And then the line went dead. Somewhere, in the depths of a secure, hidden location, the real architect of the criminal underworld was waiting, watching, ready to make the next move. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. Elena Vasquez was no stranger to danger, but this time, the stakes were beyond anything she had ever faced. She had uncovered corruption before, exposed government scandals, and even received death threats. But the forces she was now up against, the unseen hand guiding the world's most powerful criminal network, operated at a level she hadn't thought possible. She sat on the plane bound for Dubai, her fingers trembling slightly as she refreshed her encrypted messages. She had sent a copy of her findings to a trusted colleague, someone outside the reach of US and Mexican authorities. If anything happened to her, the story wouldn't die with her. But deep down, she knew that if these people wanted her gone, there would be no trace left behind. As the aircraft taxied down the runway, she glanced over her shoulder. The man from earlier, the one who had made the silent phone call, was still there, pretending to read a newspaper. He had the air of someone who blended into the background, the kind of person trained to watch without being noticed. Elena's instincts screamed at her. She wasn't just being followed, she was being hunted. Somewhere across the globe, in a place few people could reach, the man known only as Spectre sat in a dimly lit room, watching a series of encrypted monitors. The walls were lined with high-end security feeds, financial transactions scrolling in real time, and news reports covering the fallout of Vargas' arrest. Vargas had been a necessary sacrifice, a distraction. The real machine, the one Spectre had spent decades perfecting, was still intact. The Black Ledger was not just a document, it was the foundation of a global empire. It contained the names of CEOs, politicians, high-ranking military officers, and cartel leaders who had all, at some point, traded their souls for power. It was Spectre's greatest weapon. And now, Elena Vasquez was too close to finding it. Spectre had seen journalists like her before, idealists who thought they could change the world with the truth. But what she didn't understand was that the truth didn't matter. The world didn't run on justice. It ran on control, and Spectre controlled everything. Elena's flight landed in Dubai under the cover of night. The sprawling metropolis glittered like a jewel in the desert, its towering skyscrapers a symbol of untouchable wealth and power. But beneath the city's polished surface, a darker world thrived, one where money could buy anything, and where men like Spectre operated in the shadows. She moved quickly through customs, her nerves on edge. The man from the plane was still following her, keeping his distance but never out of sight. She checked into a modest hotel, avoiding anything too high-profile. From there, she reached out to her contact, a whistleblower who had once worked as a financial analyst for a bank suspected of laundering cartel money. He had promised her information that could finally lead her to the Black Ledger's hidden location. But when she arrived at their meeting point, a small cafe in the outskirts of the city, she found the man slumped over in his chair, a thin red line across his throat. The message was clear. She was already too late. Panic set in. Elena had spent years believing that knowledge was power, that the truth would always triumph. But as she stood in the dimly lit cafe, staring at the lifeless body of the only person who could have helped her, she realized the terrifying truth. These people were always 10 steps ahead. She turned to leave, but the moment she stepped outside, a black SUV screeched to a halt in front of her. 2 men in suits got out. No badges, no introductions, just the cold, professional demeanor of men who had done this many times before. Elena ran. She darted through the alleyways, her heart pounding, adrenaline surging through her veins. She had no illusions. If they caught her, she wouldn't just disappear. She would be erased, her existence wiped from history like countless others who had come too close. She reached a crowded marketplace, ducking into a sea of people. The scent of spices and grilled meat filled the air, but she had no time to breathe it in. She had to get out. Somewhere behind her, she heard the heavy footsteps of the men closing in. She spotted a side exit leading to a narrow street and sprinted toward it, only to be yanked back by a powerful grip on her arm. For a moment, she thought it was one of the men. But then she saw his face. It wasn't them. It was someone else. Someone unexpected. The man pulled her into a waiting car, slamming the door shut behind them as the vehicle sped away. Elena gasped for breath, her mind racing. "Who?" she started, but the man held up a hand, silencing her. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice low and urgent. Elena studied him. He was in his mid-40s, with sharp features and the kind of presence that commanded attention. He wasn't a journalist, that much was clear. He wasn't law enforcement either. And then she saw it, the tattoo on his wrist. A symbol she had seen only once before, in the classified files of Vargas' most trusted lieutenant. Her blood turned cold. "You work for them," she whispered. The man met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I used to." Elena's mind reeled. Was this a setup? Another trap? But then he did something she didn't expect. He handed her a flash drive. "This is what you're looking for," he said. "Everything. The ledger, the names, the accounts." Elena stared at him in shock. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you giving this to me?" For the first time, the man's expression softened. "Because I made a mistake," he said. "I thought we were just running a business. But I didn't see what it really was. I didn't see what he really was." Elena clutched the flash drive like it was her last lifeline. "Then help me," she said. "Help me stop this." The man hesitated. And then, for the first time in his life, he chose to betray the only thing he had ever known. As the car disappeared into the Dubai night, Spectre sat in his darkened room, watching the monitors with an unreadable expression. He had known this day would come. The moment Vargas fell, the moment the ledger became exposed, it was only a matter of time before someone tried to bring it all crashing down. But Spectre didn't fear exposure, because he knew one truth that people like Elena would never understand. Empires didn't fall because of scandals. They fell because someone more powerful decided it was their time to fall. And Spectre was still the one holding the strings. He turned away from the screen and made a single call. No orders. No threats. Just one sentence. It's time for the next move. And somewhere, in the deepest shadows of the world, a new game had already begun. Case 3. The humid summer air clung to the coastline of northern Australia, where the vast and unforgiving waters of the Pacific met the rugged cliffs and desolate beaches. In this vast expanse, where civilization thinned and law enforcement struggled to monitor every inch of its coastline, a man named Daniel "Danny" O'Keefe thrived in the shadows. He was not a common criminal, nor a reckless outlaw. He was a mastermind, a strategist, and a ghost in the system. Born in Sydney in the early 1970s, Danny had once been a bright student, the kind of child who could have had a promising future in finance or international business. His father was a respected lawyer, his mother a school principal, and his siblings all followed paths of conventional success. But Danny was different. From a young age, he showed an uncanny ability to manipulate, to read people, and to anticipate their needs and weaknesses. By his early 20s, he had abandoned formal education and instead immersed himself in the underworld, starting with small-scale fraud and black market deals before moving on to something much larger: international drug trafficking and human smuggling. For years, Danny operated in the shadows, keeping a low profile while expanding his network. His empire stretched from Southeast Asia to South America, using Australia as both a market and a transit point. Unlike many drug lords, he did not live flamboyantly. He owned no flashy sports cars or sprawling mansions. Instead, he lived in a modest home in Melbourne, blending in with ordinary society, while secretly running one of the most sophisticated smuggling operations in the Southern Hemisphere. The plan that would define Danny's criminal legacy began in 2015. It was audacious, intricate, and if successful, would be one of the largest drug and human trafficking operations in Australian history. The premise was simple: use the cover of legitimate shipping businesses to move massive quantities of illicit substances and undocumented individuals across international borders. The execution, however, required meticulous planning. Danny partnered with criminal organizations in Asia and South America, ensuring a steady supply of high-grade narcotics, methamphetamine, heroin, and cocaine, while also establishing connections with networks specializing in human smuggling. These organizations provided access to vulnerable populations, desperate individuals willing to risk everything for a chance at a better life. To them, Australia represented hope. To Danny, they were nothing more than commodities. His operation revolved around commercial shipping vessels, cargo containers, and a network of corrupt officials who facilitated smooth transactions. The shipments were hidden within legitimate goods: industrial machinery, agricultural products, and even medical supplies. Each shipment carried not only drugs worth millions, but also groups of people crammed into hidden compartments, their fates sealed the moment they boarded. But such a large operation could not go unnoticed forever. Law enforcement agencies across multiple countries had long suspected Australia was a major hub for trafficking, and by 2016, a coalition of Australian Border Force, the Australian Federal Police, and international agencies had begun quietly investigating suspicious shipping activities. While many traffickers had been caught over the years, Danny remained untouchable. He never personally handled any shipments, never directly communicated with lower-level operatives, and never left behind a clear paper trail. However, in early 2017, a seemingly routine cargo inspection in Darwin changed everything. A shipping container, supposedly carrying machinery from Malaysia, was flagged for further scrutiny due to discrepancies in its paperwork. When officers pried it open, they found an air-conditioned compartment within the steel walls, packed with 26 individuals, men, women, and children, malnourished, dehydrated, and barely conscious. Alongside them were dozens of vacuum-sealed packages containing high-purity methamphetamine, estimated to be worth over 200 million Australian dollars on the street. The discovery sent shockwaves through Australian law enforcement. This was not just another smuggling attempt. It was a revelation of the sheer scale and sophistication of an operation that had remained hidden for years. The investigation immediately expanded, and authorities traced the shipment's origins, uncovering links to multiple companies, offshore accounts, and coded transactions leading back to Danny O'Keefe. But Danny, ever the strategist, had anticipated the possibility of such a disruption. He had layers of insulation between himself and the shipments, and his network of trusted associates ensured that any direct connection to him remained obscured. Even as authorities closed in, he remained calm, continuing his operations as if nothing had changed. However, the discovery in Darwin had set off a chain reaction. International agencies intensified their efforts, and undercover operatives infiltrated his network. Over the next several months, more shipments were intercepted, containers in Sydney, Perth, and Brisbane, each carrying human cargo and narcotics. Slowly, the pieces of Danny's empire began to crumble. By mid-2017, law enforcement had compiled enough evidence to issue a warrant for his arrest. But Danny O'Keefe was no ordinary criminal. He had spent decades preparing for the possibility of being hunted. When authorities raided his Melbourne home, they found nothing but an empty residence. He had vanished, leaving behind only fragmented financial records and burner phones. His disappearance triggered one of the largest manhunts in Australian history. From the bustling streets of Bangkok to the remote islands of the Pacific, his last known contacts were interrogated, his assets seized, and his closest associates arrested. Yet, for months, there was no trace of him. But Danny had underestimated the reach of modern surveillance and the relentlessness of law enforcement. In early 2018, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a small banking transaction in Argentina, traced to a shell company linked to his alias. The lead led investigators to a luxurious but discreet villa in Uruguay, where they finally cornered him. The arrest of Danny O'Keefe was more than just the downfall of one man. It was the culmination of years of investigation, a victory against one of the most elusive criminals in Australian history. When he was extradited to Australia, the media frenzy was relentless. His trial revealed the extent of his empire, billions laundered, thousands of people smuggled, and an intricate network spanning continents. The court sentenced him to life in prison, marking the end of an era. But even behind bars, questions remained. How many others like him operated in the shadows? How many victims had suffered, lost in the vast machinery of organized crime? And most chilling of all, was this truly the end, or merely a chapter in an ongoing saga of crime that thrived in the hidden corridors of the world? Danny O'Keefe sat in the maximum security wing of Barwon Prison, staring at the gray concrete walls that had become his world. His trial had been one of the most widely publicized cases in Australian history, yet despite the overwhelming evidence, he never spoke a word in court. He sat in silence as prosecutors detailed the horrors of his empire, the thousands of people smuggled, the hundreds of millions in drug profits, and the countless lives ruined. The judge called him one of the most methodical and ruthless criminals of the modern era, a mastermind who had evaded capture for years through sheer cunning and calculated foresight. But the truth was, Danny never saw himself as a villain. To him, the world was built on exploitation, and he had simply played the game better than most. Governments turned a blind eye to suffering when it wasn't profitable to intervene. Corporations built empires on the backs of desperate laborers. He was no different. He had given people what they wanted: drugs for the addicted, escape for the desperate, and wealth for those willing to take risks. If anything, he had only exposed the hypocrisy of a world that thrived on greed and desperation. Yet, despite all his planning, he had made one fatal mistake: trust. Danny had spent decades ensuring his empire ran on loyalty and fear. Everyone who worked for him knew that betrayal meant death, not by his own hand, but by the ruthless enforcers who carried out his orders. And for years it worked. But as law enforcement tightened their grip, cracks began to form. One by one, his closest allies were arrested, and with the threat of life sentences looming over them, deals were made. Information was exchanged. Secrets were spilled. It wasn't just his drug empire that unraveled. It was the web of connections that had kept him untouchable for years. His offshore accounts were frozen, his network dismantled piece by piece, and the trust that had once made him invincible became his greatest weakness. But Danny had always planned for the worst. He knew the system better than most, and he had prepared for the day when he would no longer be free. Hidden among the layers of his empire were contingency plans, offshore funds that even the authorities hadn't uncovered, safe houses spread across multiple countries, and most importantly, people still loyal to him, waiting for the right moment to act. Inside his prison cell, Danny remained silent. He watched, listened, and calculated. The guards saw him as a broken man, a crime lord finally brought to justice. But in reality, he was waiting, because Danny O'Keefe had never been the type to accept defeat. Far beyond the prison walls, in the underbelly of Sydney's criminal world, whispers spread. His empire had been crippled, but not destroyed. There were still those who believed in him, who owed their lives to him, and who were willing to do whatever it took to bring him back. The question was not whether Danny O'Keefe would escape. The question was when. Inside the sterile, dimly lit walls of Barwon Prison, Danny O'Keefe was anything but a broken man. His silence was not submission, it was strategy. He had learned long ago that patience was the most valuable weapon a man in his position could wield. The outside world believed they had won, that the most methodical crime lord in modern Australian history had been reduced to just another inmate. But they didn't know Danny. Every night, as he lay on his cot in the cold darkness, he replayed every step that had led him here, dissecting the mistakes, analyzing every betrayal. The weight of his empire had once rested on his ability to control people, but in the end, it had been people who had brought him down. Yet Danny understood something that law enforcement never could. Loyalty and fear were not the only tools of control. Power, true power, was knowing the human condition better than anyone else. And Danny had always known exactly how to manipulate the desperate, the greedy, and the weak-willed. While the world believed his empire had crumbled, Danny knew better. The authorities had taken down his top lieutenants, frozen his most obvious assets, and seized properties linked to his known aliases. But what they didn't understand was that Danny's reach extended far beyond what could be traced on paper. For every name the police had on their lists, there were a dozen more they didn't. For every million they had frozen, another million sat untouched in private accounts under names that had never been connected to him. His network hadn't been destroyed, it had only gone silent. Hidden, waiting. While Danny bided his time, the remnants of his operation remained in motion. In the darkest corners of Sydney's underworld, in the neon-lit bars where whispers of betrayal and opportunity intermingled over glasses of whiskey, his name still carried weight. The power vacuum left in his absence had ignited a war between rival factions, each one desperate to carve out a piece of what had once been Danny's. But among the chaos, there were still those who remained loyal. A man like Danny never built an empire alone. Over the years, he had cultivated a network of professionals, smugglers, hackers, financiers, and enforcers, each chosen for their specific skills and unwavering discretion. While many had cut ties the moment his empire fell, a select few had remained in the shadows, waiting for his signal. And that signal was coming. Across the Pacific, in a high-rise apartment in Hong Kong, a man named Jian Wei sat in front of a bank of monitors, his fingers moving rapidly over a keyboard. To the world, Jian was nothing more than a mild-mannered investment banker, but in reality, he was one of the most brilliant money launderers Danny had ever encountered. Over the years, he had quietly funneled billions through layers of shell companies, cryptocurrency transactions, and off-the-books financial instruments. Now, with Danny behind bars, Jian had begun the process of unfreezing the accounts that had been hidden even from Danny's closest associates. In Argentina, a woman known only as Valeria made contact with a retired pilot who owed Danny his life. The man had spent years smuggling people and cargo through routes so well rehearsed they had become second nature to him. With one call, he was back in the game. In Thailand, an old friend of Danny's arranged for a shipment of forged documents, passports, identification papers, and travel visas, all crafted to be undetectable by even the most sophisticated security measures. One by one, the pieces began to move, and in Barwon prison, Danny O'Keefe knew it was only a matter of time before his past caught up with him in the best way possible. Danny's plan for escape had been set in motion long before his arrest. Unlike common criminals who relied on brute force or reckless prison breaks, Danny approached his escape with the same calculated precision he had applied to every aspect of his empire. It began with the guards. Every prison had weak points, and those weak points always came in the form of people. Guards who were underpaid, desperate, or corruptible. Over the months, Danny had identified 3 men who fit the profile, one with gambling debts, one with a sick child, and one who simply hated his job. Through carefully placed messages smuggled through the prison's black market network, Danny made them an offer they couldn't refuse. The first guard, desperate for money to cover his debts, agreed to turn a blind eye on the night of the escape. The second, needing cash for his daughter's medical treatment, agreed to disable key security cameras for exactly 3 minutes at a designated time. The third, whose resentment toward the prison system ran deep, agreed to look the other way as Danny and his team made their move. With the inside taken care of, the outside plan was set into motion. A team of mercenaries, hired through proxies and paid in cryptocurrency, had been dispatched to create a diversion, an explosion at an electrical substation 3 miles from the prison. The resulting blackout would throw security systems into chaos, leaving just enough time for Danny's carefully orchestrated escape. The night of the breakout arrived. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the lights flickered, then died. The prison was plunged into darkness. In the confusion, the prearranged guard unlocked Danny's cell. Within 60 seconds, Danny was moving through the corridors, slipping past disabled security cameras, following a pre-mapped route that led to a service tunnel beneath the prison. By the time the backup generators kicked in, he was already gone. When authorities finally pieced together the events of the night, Danny O'Keefe had vanished without a trace. For weeks, his escape dominated the headlines. News anchors speculated about his whereabouts, while law enforcement agencies launched one of the largest manhunts in Australian history. Airports were monitored, ports were locked down, and borders were put on high alert. But Danny had planned for this. By the time the world realized he was missing, he was already thousands of miles away. A private jet, piloted by the very man who had once smuggled cargo for him, had taken off from an undisclosed airstrip in the Australian outback. His destination? Unknown. His fortune? Still intact. His empire? Quiet, but far from dead. And as Danny O'Keefe stared out the window at the endless horizon, he knew one thing for certain. He was not done yet. Case 4. In the early 2010s, Australia was facing a quiet yet catastrophic storm brewing under the surface. A global network of criminals had found their new conduit in the country's seemingly endless coastline and high-demand market for both illegal drugs and human trafficking. The scale of the operation was unlike anything Australia had encountered before, an intricate web of smuggling that intertwined pharmaceuticals and human lives. The man at the center of this web was Benjamin Ben Thomas, a name that would later be feared and loathed across the nation. A man in his mid-40s, tall with short-cropped dark hair and a stern face that showed no signs of the horrific industry he ran, Ben was a figure who had carefully constructed an empire that spanned continents. Born in Sydney, he was a child of a broken home, raised by a mother who struggled to keep him on the right path. As a teenager, Ben was already involved in petty crimes, shoplifting, drug dealing, and street fighting. But what set him apart from the typical petty criminals was his cold, calculating mind and his ruthless drive to make something of himself. By the time he was in his late 20s, Ben had risen through the ranks of the Australian criminal underground. He became involved in smuggling operations, particularly in the international drug trade. His transition from small-time dealer to large-scale operations came after he made connections with various international syndicates, primarily in Southeast Asia and Europe. It was in these connections that Ben saw the potential for a much more profitable enterprise, one that could supply not only the ever-growing Australian drug market, but also feed into the global demand for illicit human trafficking. It wasn't long before Ben's smuggling operation grew into one of the largest and most sophisticated in the country. He partnered with several corrupt officials and people from all walks of life, creating a network that was nearly impenetrable. The drugs he smuggled ranged from cocaine and ecstasy to synthetic opioids and methamphetamines, all of which were highly lucrative. But it was his involvement in human trafficking that would eventually bring his operation to light and prove to be his undoing. Ben's human trafficking network was particularly disturbing. Using his extensive network of contacts in Southeast Asia, he began to funnel people, mostly women and children, into Australia for exploitation. The victims were often from impoverished backgrounds, lured under the false promise of work, better lives, or education. They were transported under the cover of various legitimate businesses, and even through diplomatic channels, making it difficult for law enforcement to detect the illegal activity. The drugs, however, were a different story. Ben had perfected the art of hiding illicit substances in containers, inside machinery, and even within legitimate exports. His main shipping hub was in Sydney, where he had connections within the docks, allowing him to bring in huge quantities of drugs without attracting suspicion. He would then distribute the drugs throughout the country using a variety of methods, including street-level dealers, higher-level suppliers, and even corrupt officials in local law enforcement. But Ben's true brilliance lay in his ability to manipulate those around him. He didn't just use violence to maintain control, he used leverage. If anyone stepped out of line or tried to betray him, they would find themselves in a very compromising position, whether that meant threats to their families, financial ruin, or even worse. This level of control made him almost untouchable, and for a long time, it kept him hidden from the authorities. The first real crack in Ben's operation came in 2013, when a routine drug bust in Melbourne uncovered a stash of synthetic opioids. What was meant to be a standard drug seizure quickly escalated when the authorities found evidence pointing to a much larger network. The drugs found in Melbourne were traced back to a shipping company that, unbeknownst to most, had been running shipments for Ben's operation. But the authorities had no idea that this was just the tip of the iceberg. It took nearly a year before the Australian Federal Police, AFP, began to connect the dots. They had been working tirelessly, trying to track down who was behind the growing drug trade and the influx of trafficking victims into the country. But Ben was elusive, always one step ahead. His operation was so vast that it was nearly impossible to dismantle all at once. However, the AFP eventually began to piece together a network of people that had crossed paths with Ben. Through undercover operations, the authorities infiltrated Ben's distribution network, slowly gaining trust with some of his lower-level operatives. It was these operatives who unknowingly became the key to unraveling the entire empire. They provided enough information for a major operation to take place, one that would expose the full extent of the drug smuggling and human trafficking that Ben had orchestrated for years. But there was still the question of how they could catch him. Ben was careful, and with his many layers of protection, it seemed impossible to get close enough to him. Then in early 2015, an unexpected breakthrough came. A shipment of drugs was intercepted just before it hit the Australian shores. Hidden inside was not just the usual stash of methamphetamine, but human cargo. Dozens of young women and children who had been crammed into a cargo container without any ventilation or basic amenities. It was a horror that would be uncovered too late for some, but it was enough to get the attention of the authorities. They now had undeniable proof of Ben's involvement in human trafficking. The discovery of the human cargo in that shipping container was a turning point. The authorities had long suspected that the drug trade and human trafficking operations were somehow linked, but this finding provided the smoking gun they needed. It wasn't just drugs hidden in the containers anymore. It was human lives, trapped in the bowels of ships, helpless and in danger. The stakes had never been higher, and it was now clear that the Australian government had no choice but to make a concerted effort to shut down Ben Thomas's empire once and for all. In the days following the discovery, the Australian Federal Police, AFP, scrambled to piece together the full scope of the trafficking ring. Forensic experts meticulously combed through the cargo containers, trying to gather any shred of evidence that might lead them back to the people responsible for the horror. Their findings were chilling. The women and children inside the container were barely alive, having been deprived of food, water, and air for days during the long journey across the ocean. Some were unconscious, while others were too weak to even stand. It was a grim reminder of the lengths to which Ben and his associates would go for profit. What made the situation even more tragic was the fact that many of the women and children came from poor villages in Southeast Asia. They had been promised jobs, education, and better lives in Australia, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmarish cycle of abuse and exploitation. They were not the only ones. The authorities quickly realized that Ben's network had been operating for years, smuggling people into the country under false pretenses, and then forcing them into labor, sex work, or worse. As the investigation progressed, the Australian Federal Police uncovered a series of safe houses scattered across Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. These were places where the victims were kept hidden, forced to work in grim conditions, and made to endure unimaginable abuse. Some were locked in basements or back rooms of seemingly ordinary businesses, places like nail salons, massage parlors, and restaurants. Others were sold to high-profile individuals who used them for personal gain, further entrenching the horrific nature of Ben's operations. The authorities soon realized that they were up against something far more complex than a simple drug trafficking ring. Ben had used his wealth and connections to build a sophisticated network that reached into almost every corner of Australian society. His influence was far-reaching, with corrupt politicians, law enforcement officials, and business owners all turning a blind eye to his operations. Some of them were even complicit in the trafficking and drug smuggling, accepting bribes or favors in exchange for looking the other way. It was this level of corruption that made Ben's operation so difficult to dismantle. The AFP had no choice but to launch a multi-pronged operation, one that involved not only local law enforcement, but also international agencies like Interpol and the FBI. They needed to gather intelligence from all corners of the globe to understand the full extent of Ben's empire. For the first time in years, the authorities were beginning to piece together the vast and intricate puzzle that was Ben's criminal network. In the meantime, Ben remained in the shadows, continuing to operate his empire with an iron fist. He had already been alerted to the increased law enforcement activity and had begun to take precautions. His network of informants kept him well informed, allowing him to stay one step ahead of the authorities. But even Ben couldn't escape the inevitable. It was only a matter of time before the authorities would catch up to him. The breakthrough came in early 2016, when an undercover agent managed to infiltrate one of Ben's drug shipments. Posing as a low-level street dealer, the agent gained the trust of one of Ben's associates, a man named Samir Malik. Samir was a key figure in Ben's operation, responsible for overseeing the distribution of drugs across Australia. He was also a trusted enforcer, known for his violent tendencies and willingness to do whatever it took to protect the operation. The agent, working alongside a team of operatives, was able to gather critical intelligence about the location of several of Ben's key hideouts. With this information, the authorities launched a series of coordinated raids across the country. The first raid took place in Melbourne, where a stash of drugs was found in a warehouse linked to one of Ben's front companies. The haul was enormous: cocaine, methamphetamine, ecstasy, and synthetic opioids, all packed into crates and hidden beneath layers of legitimate goods. But it was what they found next that shocked everyone. Behind the warehouse, in a small, nondescript building, the authorities discovered a hidden room. Inside, they found several women who had been trafficked into Australia and forced to work in exploitative conditions. The women were malnourished and terrified, their faces etched with fear. They were immediately rescued and taken to a safe house, where they could begin the long process of recovery. As the raids continued, more and more victims were freed from their captivity. Some had been in Australia for months, while others had been held for years. Many had been subjected to physical and emotional abuse, their spirits broken by the horrors they had endured. But with each rescue, the authorities were able to gather more evidence about the scale of Ben's operations. Despite the successful raids, Ben remained elusive. He had gone into hiding, and his associates were scrambling to cover their tracks. But the AFP was closing in, and they knew they couldn't let up now. They had to capture Ben before he could disappear for good. The breakthrough came in late 2016, when an informant within Ben's inner circle provided the authorities with crucial information about his whereabouts. It turned out that Ben had been hiding in plain sight, using a series of safe houses and false identities to evade capture. But the authorities were ready. They coordinated a massive manhunt that spanned across the country, and on the evening of December 4th, 2016, they finally cornered Ben in a remote area of New South Wales. The operation was swift and decisive. Armed with warrants and intelligence, the AFP stormed Ben's hideout. A brief but intense standoff ensued, but in the end, Ben was captured without a shot being fired. He was arrested and charged with a litany of crimes, including drug trafficking, human trafficking, and organized crime. Ben's arrest was a victory for law enforcement, but it was also a sobering reminder of the dark underbelly of Australia's criminal landscape. The investigation revealed the full extent of his operations, uncovering a web of corruption, exploitation, and violence that had reached into almost every facet of society. Thousands of lives had been affected by Ben's empire, and many of the victims would never fully recover from the trauma they had experienced. In the months following Ben's arrest, authorities continued to dismantle his network. Dozens of individuals connected to his operations were arrested, and many were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The Australian government also increased its efforts to combat human trafficking, implementing stricter laws and cracking down on the exploitation of vulnerable individuals. Ben Thomas's trial began in 2017, and it was one of the most high-profile criminal cases in Australian history. The courtroom was filled with victims who had been rescued from his grip, as well as law enforcement officers who had worked tirelessly to bring him to justice. Ben's defense team tried to argue that he was merely a businessman caught up in the wrong crowd, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The trial lasted for several months, but in the end, Ben was convicted on all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison, a verdict that was seen as a victory for the victims who had suffered under his reign of terror. For many, the conviction was a bittersweet victory, knowing that it would never erase the pain and trauma they had experienced. But despite his conviction, the story of Ben Thomas was far from over. His empire may have been dismantled, but the scars he left on Australia, and on the victims he exploited, would last for generations to come. The case became a rallying cry for activists and lawmakers, pushing for stronger protections for those vulnerable to trafficking and abuse. It also served as a reminder that even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises could eventually be brought down, no matter how deeply entrenched they seemed to be. As for Ben, he was locked away in a maximum security prison, forgotten by many but not by the thousands whose lives he had ruined. And though his reign of terror was over, the lessons learned from his operation would stay with the authorities and the public forever, serving as a grim reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows of society. The impact of Ben Thomas's criminal empire on Australia's criminal landscape went far beyond the immediate dismantling of his drug and human trafficking operations. For years, the nation had been caught in a delicate balancing act, fighting organized crime, trying to protect the vulnerable, and keeping up with international demands for combating the global trade in narcotics and human beings. But Ben had pushed the limits of that balance, turning Australia into a major node in a global network that spanned multiple continents. The true scale of the operation, now fully exposed, sent shockwaves through both the criminal world and law enforcement communities. For months following Ben's arrest, the authorities struggled to put together the pieces of the empire he had built. His operations were sophisticated, well-funded, and more dangerously, embedded in the very systems designed to protect society. His ability to leverage legitimate businesses as fronts for illicit activities had made it incredibly difficult for anyone to detect what was truly happening under the surface. While law enforcement had uncovered a number of hideouts and safe houses where victims were held, the true depth of the criminal network was only starting to come to light. Australia, long considered an isolated and somewhat protected nation, was revealed to be a critical hub in a much larger web of criminal activity. In the days following Ben's arrest, the authorities worked tirelessly, investigating his extensive network and collaborating with international law enforcement agencies. The scope of the investigation was unprecedented. Teams of AFP agents, working with Interpol and the FBI, scrambled to decode the layers of Ben's empire, all while continuing to focus on the victims who needed immediate care and assistance. Each survivor rescued from the clutches of this operation had their own story to tell, a story that revealed just how far Ben Thomas's reach extended. Their voices became an essential part of the investigation, providing vital information about how the operation had been run. The first step in ensuring that the network did not continue in the wake of Ben's arrest was to systematically dismantle the front businesses he had used. These included everything from seemingly harmless massage parlors to a network of legitimate businesses, like bars and nightclubs, that were later revealed to be used as a cover for trafficking and drug distribution. Some of these businesses were spread across several major cities in Australia. The authorities initially faced enormous resistance, with some business owners using Ben's influence to protect themselves or hide their involvement. It became clear that Ben had carefully cultivated relationships with influential individuals across the country, ranging from small-time criminals to high-powered businessmen who had helped him operate under the radar. Simultaneously, the Australian government was forced to reckon with the deep societal issues that allowed such an operation to thrive for so long. Human trafficking was not a problem unique to Australia. It was a global issue that affected countless nations. However, the country's role as a primary destination for Ben's victims highlighted significant gaps in the law and law enforcement procedures. Although Australia had some of the strongest laws regarding human trafficking, they were simply not enough to combat the sheer scale of the operation. The case sparked a nationwide conversation about human trafficking, how to prevent it, how to identify it when it occurred, and most importantly, how to protect the vulnerable from becoming victims in the first place. The authorities recognized that they were dealing with a highly organized and deeply embedded network. Ben's criminal syndicate had built its empire on exploiting weaknesses in various institutions, including the country's immigration system. This was evident from the testimonies of many survivors who had been promised new lives in Australia, only to be forced into brutal labor and sex work upon arrival. Some victims were brought in under the guise of legitimate work visas, while others were transported illegally, often with fake documents or false identities that made their entry into the country appear legitimate. Once they had crossed the border, their passports were seized, and they were kept in a state of constant fear, powerless to leave or report their situation. Many had been trafficked under the promise of lucrative jobs, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare. The survivors, some of whom had been in Australia for years, were now provided with the opportunity to rebuild their lives. Although the trauma they had experienced would never leave them, the Australian government, in collaboration with NGOs and survivor advocacy groups, set up specialized rehabilitation programs to help them regain some semblance of their former lives. These programs, while essential, were not without their challenges. For many survivors, the emotional and physical scars were too deep, the psychological toll too heavy to overcome in a short period of time. The process of healing was slow and fraught with setbacks. But amid all the tragedy, there were also moments of hope. As survivors came forward with their stories, many felt empowered to speak out, raising awareness about the human trafficking epidemic that had long plagued Australia. This outpouring of testimony galvanized activists and lawmakers to push for stronger protections for victims of trafficking. The Australian government enacted sweeping reforms to strengthen its laws on human trafficking, increasing penalties for offenders and improving procedures for victim identification. They also began to focus on the rehabilitation of survivors, offering resources like housing, education, job training, and psychological support to help those rescued from trafficking reintegrate into society. However, while these efforts were a step in the right direction, there was still much to be done. Ben's capture may have marked the fall of one of Australia's most notorious criminals, but the infrastructure he had built was not easily destroyed. The criminal organizations that had benefited from his trafficking ring were still operational. The Australian Federal Police, AFP, knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. The focus had shifted to dismantling the remaining members of the syndicate who had gone into hiding, and bringing down other dangerous criminal groups who had been working with or for Ben. Months passed, and while law enforcement made significant strides, there was a pervasive feeling that this was an ongoing war, one that couldn't be won in a single raid or trial. The global human trafficking trade was a complex web of connections, with corrupt officials, powerful criminal organizations, and vulnerable people caught in the middle. The reality of the situation was harsh. For every survivor rescued, there were many more victims still out there. This sobering thought was never far from the minds of those who had been involved in the investigation. The stakes were not just about arresting criminals. They were about saving lives and preventing more people from becoming victims of the same fate. But even as Ben Thomas sat in a high-security prison awaiting trial, his legacy loomed large. The investigation into his empire had exposed the uncomfortable truth that human trafficking was a systemic issue, one that transcended borders and cultures. Ben had not been working in isolation. He was just one cog in a much larger machine. It was this realization that drove the authorities to expand their efforts, not only within Australia, but also globally. With Interpol and international agencies working in concert, the efforts to dismantle the global trafficking ring that Ben had been a part of became a priority. In 2017, Australian authorities launched a series of joint operations with law enforcement agencies in Southeast Asia, targeting the routes used to smuggle people into Australia. These operations, while risky and time-consuming, were necessary to prevent similar operations from taking root in the future. The collaboration with other countries highlighted the interconnected nature of the criminal organizations that spanned continents, from Southeast Asia to Australia and beyond. Ben Thomas's trial began in earnest in the second half of 2017, but it was clear that the case against him was just the tip of the iceberg. The full scope of his operations would take years to fully uncover. It was only with the cooperation of multiple countries, survivors, and dedicated law enforcement officials that the true extent of his criminal empire would be laid bare. While the conviction of Ben Thomas would serve as a symbol of the fight against organized crime, the struggle to combat human trafficking and drug smuggling remained an ongoing battle. Through all the darkness, though, there was a faint glimmer of light. The survivors, empowered by their ability to speak out and demand justice, became the voices of change. Their courage, resilience, and determination to rise above the horrors they had endured stood as a testament to the strength of the human spirit. It was these voices, speaking out in defiance of the horrors of their past, that would ultimately inspire the reform needed to prevent future tragedies. And for Australia, Ben Thomas's arrest and the subsequent investigations into his network served as a brutal wake-up call, one that would change the country's approach to criminal enterprises forever. The fight was far from over, but it had sparked a change, not just in the way Australia viewed organized crime, but in how it would approach the protection of the vulnerable in the future. The price of this awareness, however, had been paid in the suffering of many, and the scars of Ben's reign would be felt for generations to come. But with each passing day, the country worked tirelessly to heal, rebuild, and make sure that no one else would fall victim to the same fate. The story of Ben Thomas and his criminal empire was one of exploitation, greed, and suffering, but it was also a story of resilience, justice, and the power of hope. The investigation into Ben Thomas's criminal network stretched into 2018, and though the primary figure was in custody, the ripple effects of his empire were far-reaching. Law enforcement had uncovered a network that involved dozens of individuals, from low-level couriers to high-ranking officials who had turned a blind eye to the operations for years. As the Australian Federal Police, AFP, sifted through the data recovered from Ben's encrypted communications, they realized the depth of his operations. What had initially seemed like a straightforward case of drug trafficking and human smuggling had evolved into an intricate web of international connections and criminal enterprises that operated on a scale previously thought to be unimaginable. Ben had been one of the masterminds of a multinational syndicate that spanned across borders, exploiting the vulnerabilities of countries like Australia, the Philippines, and Thailand. His reach had extended into the very heart of Southeast Asia, where his trafficking routes for both drugs and human beings were a common thread in the region's criminal underworld. He had connections with gangs that controlled entire cities, who in turn were able to smuggle in thousands of people every year. For every victim, Ben had promised a better life, one that ended in exploitation, abuse, and forced labor. But even as the law enforcement agencies began to dismantle the syndicate, a new layer of complexity emerged. It wasn't just about intercepting drugs or saving trafficked victims anymore. It became apparent that the very systems designed to stop these kinds of crimes were themselves part of the problem. Corruption had infiltrated the immigration services, police forces, and even the judiciary. Bribes were common, and officials had been complicit in Ben's activities, often turning a blind eye to his operations, or even aiding in the passage of goods and people into Australia. It was an uncomfortable truth, but one that had to be faced head-on. For years, Australia had prided itself on its immigration policies, its strong economy, and its ability to maintain a sense of security. But with the revelations about the extent of Ben's operations, it became clear that these safeguards were vulnerable. The impact of his crimes had revealed systemic flaws in the very fabric of Australian society, particularly within the law enforcement and immigration systems. As public outrage grew, the government faced immense pressure to make sweeping reforms and to rebuild the trust of its citizens, who had felt betrayed by the very institutions meant to protect them. While the investigation continued, so did the efforts to help the survivors. Many of the people rescued from Ben's network were taken to secure shelters where they could begin to recover from the trauma they had endured. Some had been trafficked for years, others had been in Australia only a few months, but all shared similar stories of manipulation, control, and fear. They had been brought into the country with the promise of legitimate work, only to be locked into a system that exploited their labor and bodies. Some survivors, who had been exploited in the sex industry, struggled with the most profound emotional scars. These women, and in some cases men, had endured unspeakable abuse. They had been denied their freedom, their rights, and in many cases their dignity. When they were rescued, they were often in shock, unable to process the reality of their situation. Some had been brainwashed into believing that their circumstances were the result of their own failings or bad luck. Many had been told that if they didn't comply with their traffickers, they would be abandoned in a foreign country with no means of survival. One such woman, Maria, had been in Australia for over a year. She had been promised a job in a beauty salon in Melbourne. She was shown photos of glamorous women living their lives in Australia, enjoying the sun and the opportunities that came with living in the country. The reality, however, was far different. Maria was forced to work in a brothel, subjected to brutal conditions, and her passport was taken away, leaving her with no way to escape. She was afraid to speak out, not knowing who to trust, until the day when a stranger, an undercover police officer posing as a customer, finally gave her the opportunity to escape. Her story was not unique. As more victims came forward, it became evident that Ben had exploited an entire generation of vulnerable people, preying on their dreams of a better life. Many survivors struggled with feelings of guilt, shame, and fear. Their recovery, though aided by therapists and support groups, was not easy. For some, the trauma would never fully heal. But the courage shown by survivors like Maria became a catalyst for change. It was their bravery in coming forward that helped law enforcement continue their work, unraveling the tangled mess of Ben's criminal enterprise. The years following Ben's arrest were marked by a series of international collaborations aimed at eradicating the human trafficking networks that had operated so seamlessly. The AFP, working alongside global organizations like Interpol, focused on identifying trafficking routes and bringing those responsible to justice. While some of Ben's co-conspirators were caught and convicted, others managed to evade capture, retreating to other parts of the world where their connections provided them with safe havens. The pursuit of these criminals would continue for years, as the international reach of their operations was undeniable. Ben's trial was a prolonged affair, spanning several years due to the complexity of the charges. He faced a range of offenses, from drug trafficking to human trafficking, organized crime, and money laundering. Prosecutors sought the maximum sentence, arguing that his actions had caused immeasurable harm to countless individuals, both directly and indirectly. His defense team, however, mounted an aggressive campaign, attempting to paint him as a victim of circumstance, a man who had simply been a cog in a much larger machine. But as the evidence mounted, it became clear that Ben was more than just a figurehead. He was a mastermind, a person who had planned every detail of his operation with chilling precision. In 2019, after a lengthy legal battle, Ben Thomas was convicted on multiple counts of trafficking, organized crime, and drug-related offenses. His sentencing was a moment of reckoning for Australia. The trial brought the full scale of his crimes into the light, and the damage caused by his actions could no longer be ignored. The survivors of his empire were finally given the opportunity to testify in court, sharing their stories in front of a public audience. For some, this was a moment of catharsis, a chance to confront their abuser in the most powerful way possible. For others, it was a painful reminder of the horrors they had endured. Ben's sentence was long, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But the sentence itself was not what defined the case. It was the systemic changes that followed, the reforms that sought to dismantle the very structures that had allowed such a network to thrive. The Australian government, working alongside human rights organizations, introduced a range of new policies aimed at combating human trafficking. The reforms focused on victim support, legal protections, and international cooperation. But they also placed a greater emphasis on prevention, recognizing that the key to ending human trafficking was not just prosecuting the perpetrators, but also addressing the root causes that allowed it to flourish. The story of Ben Thomas was a tragic one, an example of how unchecked greed and corruption could wreak havoc on society. But it was also a story of resilience. It was a story of the victims who survived, of the law enforcement officers who risked their lives to uncover the truth, and of the communities that rallied together to heal the wounds left by his empire. Australia would never be the same after Ben's arrest, but the reforms and the awareness that emerged in the aftermath laid the groundwork for a better future. As Ben sat in his prison cell, awaiting the slow passage of time, the world outside began to change. His empire had crumbled, but the lessons learned from his reign of terror would shape Australia's approach to organized crime for generations to come. The country was stronger now, more aware of the vulnerabilities that had been exploited by criminals like Ben. And while the battle against human trafficking was far from over, the story of Ben Thomas's fall was one of hope and determination, of a society that refused to let darkness define its future. The years following Ben Thomas's conviction brought a deep reflection to Australia and its international partners. The fall of one of the largest criminal syndicates in the region had stirred much attention, but also laid bare the long-neglected issues within law enforcement systems, the immigration process, and the harsh realities of human trafficking. The work was far from done. It had only just begun. The survivors of Ben's network, those brave souls who had found the strength to speak out and seek a way out of the darkness, were not forgotten. In fact, their testimonies became the foundation of an ongoing movement that spurred global efforts to combat modern-day slavery. In the years that followed, Australia launched an unprecedented coalition of government bodies, non-governmental organizations, and advocacy groups aimed at preventing the trafficking of people and drugs into the country. Their work included improving data sharing with international agencies, conducting deep audits of immigration processes, and offering better training to law enforcement officials who might encounter victims of trafficking. Yet, one thing became abundantly clear. The battle was not just a matter of putting criminals behind bars. It was about dismantling entire systems of exploitation that were embedded in global trade, migration patterns, and even the very ways societies operated. Meanwhile, Ben remained locked away in a high-security prison. His trial long concluded, but his influence still very much felt within the criminal networks. Despite his downfall, his associates had been relentless in their efforts to keep their operations running. With Ben behind bars, they were desperate to maintain control over their vast resources, including drug supply routes, illegal labor markets, and the new, high-value commodity that had come to define their operations: information. Ben had always been a meticulous planner, a strategist who understood the value of keeping his finger on the pulse of the world. Even within the confines of his prison, he still had access to a network of operatives who were loyal to him. Through encrypted messaging, a shadow world of communication continued to thrive, one that could evade the prying eyes of the authorities. Despite his incarceration, Ben's presence in the criminal underworld was far from over, and law enforcement agencies around the globe were now faced with a new set of challenges. With the rise of digital technology and encrypted communications, criminal syndicates like Ben's could operate with impunity, always staying one step ahead of the law. Yet, the attention Ben had garnered led to a crackdown on organized crime in general. The high-profile nature of his arrest, coupled with the public outcry over the human trafficking aspect of his operations, resulted in a more unified and global approach to tackling transnational crime. Governments realized that simply focusing on one criminal mastermind, however successful they might be, was not enough. If they were to stamp out these operations for good, they would have to cut off the supply chains and systems that sustain them. In 2021, an international summit was convened, bringing together global leaders, law enforcement officials, human rights organizations, and survivors to discuss the future of human trafficking prevention. The summit, hosted in Australia, marked a historic turning point in the fight against trafficking. It was a chance to not only share the lessons learned from Ben's case, but to forge new international collaborations and set actionable goals for the next decade. One of the main outcomes was the establishment of a new task force dedicated solely to combating human trafficking, focusing on both prevention and intervention. One of the major revelations from the summit came from a report shared by the International Organization for Migration, IOM, which detailed how traffickers often preyed upon the most vulnerable members of society: those without resources, those without strong family networks, and those desperate for opportunities. Many victims came from developing countries, lured by promises of work in prosperous nations like Australia. Others were tricked into believing they were participating in legal immigration processes, only to be forced into labor or sexual exploitation upon arrival. For the survivors who had come forward during Ben's trial, the summit offered a new chapter in their journey. Many of them had lived in fear for years, terrified of deportation or being ignored by the system. But now, with organizations dedicated to helping them rebuild their lives, survivors began to reclaim their agency. The international community, for the first time, was fully engaged in a joint effort to restore dignity and freedom to those whose lives had been shattered by the likes of Ben Thomas. Maria, who had been one of the first survivors to speak out in court during Ben's trial, attended the summit. By then, she had rebuilt much of her life. She had found work as a counselor, helping others who had been trafficked and helping them rebuild the pieces of their shattered lives. The journey hadn't been easy. She had struggled with depression, PTSD, and the haunting memories of her exploitation. But as she spoke on stage at the summit, Maria's voice was filled with hope. Her testimony became a rallying cry for more immediate action. She spoke of the helplessness she felt when she was trapped in the brothel, the sense of shame she had carried with her for so long, and the resilience that had slowly allowed her to heal. In her speech, she reminded the audience that the world could not afford to look the other way. Every year, thousands of people were trafficked into the country, many of whom were being used and abused in ways unimaginable to the public. The survivor-focused approach became a central theme of the summit, and new laws were proposed in Australia to protect the rights of those who had been trafficked. A number of bills were passed that created new legal protections for trafficking victims, which included immunity from prosecution for illegal immigration status and an expansion of financial assistance for recovery programs. The trauma of trafficking did not end the moment a victim was rescued. It often lasted a lifetime. Survivors needed long-term support, and Australia recognized the need to step up in providing that. For law enforcement, the summit created the opportunity for networking and collaboration on a global scale. Investigators from all over the world were able to share tactics, insights, and experiences about how to tackle the issue of human trafficking more effectively. Information-sharing platforms were created, connecting law enforcement agencies across borders and enabling them to track trafficking routes more efficiently. National intelligence networks were upgraded, utilizing cutting-edge surveillance technologies to identify trafficking rings operating in real time. Australia became a hub for these collaborations, offering training programs and courses for police officers, social workers, and immigration officers from countries around the world. The goal was to equip these professionals with the tools necessary to identify trafficking victims and prevent future exploitation. Much of this involved teaching them how to recognize the subtle signs of trafficking, the fear in a person's eyes, the nervousness in their demeanor, the way they would often remain silent or too afraid to speak. As the years passed, the outcomes of the summit began to bear fruit. The number of trafficking incidents in Australia began to decrease, though it was clear the issue was far from eradicated. Criminal syndicates, like the one Ben had headed, had found new ways to operate, but they were also becoming more exposed. The international reach of Australia's efforts had ripple effects that stretched across the globe, including new crackdowns on international human trafficking hubs in Thailand, the Philippines, and other Southeast Asian countries. Ben's legacy, while one of unimaginable destruction, was also the driving force behind the global fight to stop human trafficking. His name became synonymous with the darkest aspects of the international criminal underworld, but his downfall also marked the beginning of a new era in global cooperation. An era where survivors were heard, where criminals could no longer hide in the shadows, and where the fight for justice was no longer just an individual country's struggle, but a collective mission shared by the world. Australia had faced an unprecedented crisis, and while the battle was ongoing, the nation had risen to the challenge. It had become a symbol of resilience, of taking ownership of past failures, and of building a stronger future for those whose lives had been torn apart. The fight to dismantle human trafficking was far from over, but thanks to the lessons learned from the fall of Ben Thomas, the world was better equipped to confront it. As the years passed, the ripple effect of Ben Thomas's downfall continued to reverberate across the globe. The once invisible world of human trafficking and illegal drug smuggling had been thrust into the public eye, forcing governments, law enforcement agencies, and society at large to confront the harsh realities of these dark industries. Australia, in particular, found itself at the forefront of this global effort, not just as a victim of Ben's syndicate, but as a beacon for those hoping to understand how a nation could transform itself in the wake of such trauma. In the aftermath of the summit, the survivors' voices became central to the ongoing dialogue surrounding human trafficking. Maria, having spent years rebuilding her life and now an advocate for others, became one of the most influential figures in this new era of change. Her presence at conferences, at advocacy events, and in front of lawmakers proved that the survivors of such dark experiences could become some of the most powerful agents for change. As she spoke to audiences around the world, her words carried the weight of lived experience, and people listened, truly listened. She began a foundation dedicated to helping trafficking survivors reintegrate into society, offering counseling services, legal aid, job training, and even housing. Her foundation's work was critical in shifting the focus from just punitive measures against traffickers to a more nuanced and compassionate approach to recovery. Maria, and others like her, understood that true healing could not occur without addressing the underlying trauma, and that healing could not be done in isolation. It needed to be a community effort. For Australia, Maria's foundation was an important step forward. The government took a closer look at its own systems, immigration, border security, and the economic vulnerabilities that traffickers had used to their advantage. The task force dedicated to dismantling human trafficking rings became a well-funded and highly visible operation. Law enforcement agencies received better training on recognizing the subtle signs of trafficking, and social workers were equipped with the tools they needed to identify potential victims and provide the proper support. The National Human Trafficking Hotline, once underfunded and understaffed, was revamped and made more accessible to the public, allowing concerned citizens to report suspicious activities more easily. A dedicated task force of international law enforcement agencies, working in coordination with Australia's police force, began to unravel more cases of cross-border trafficking. The operation, named Operation Crossfire, was an ambitious multi-year initiative to not only address human trafficking, but also disrupt the narcotics trade that fed off the profits of human exploitation. The primary goal of Operation Crossfire was to sever the connection between drug cartels and human trafficking syndicates, which had once been Ben's specialty. Investigations revealed that these organizations were no longer just focused on smuggling narcotics. They were now trafficking people on a much larger scale, using the same routes and networks that had previously been used to move drugs across borders. The connections between the two industries were chillingly clear. Ben's former associates were being hunted down one by one, their names, once feared in the underworld, now the subject of intelligence gathering and tactical operations. The worldwide network of human traffickers, who had once felt untouchable, was now in a state of turmoil. Even as law enforcement cracked down on smaller players, they were also slowly but surely breaking the backbone of the operations that had once been run by men like Ben Thomas. But as the years wore on, a more insidious problem began to emerge. The very structures that had enabled the success of Ben's operation, the corruption, the greed, and the exploitation, did not simply disappear. They evolved. More sophisticated, decentralized groups emerged, leveraging new technologies to stay ahead of the law. In some ways, the fight against trafficking had moved from a physical battle to a digital one. Encrypted communications, dark web marketplaces, and the ease of cross-border transactions online had made it more difficult for authorities to track and disrupt operations. The rise of digital trafficking was an alarming shift. Criminal syndicates began using online platforms and social media to lure in victims. Young women and men, desperate for a way out of poverty or seeking a brighter future, were deceived by promises of high-paying jobs in other countries. Through the internet, they were sold the dream of a new life, one where they would be trained in a skill, provided with accommodation, and offered the kind of opportunities they could only hope for. However, upon arrival in foreign countries like Australia, they found themselves trapped in brothels, construction sites, or forced labor in dangerous industries, with no recourse to escape. Maria's foundation played a critical role in educating the public about this new wave of trafficking. The internet, once thought of as a tool for empowerment, had become a new weapon for traffickers. Maria, alongside other advocates, began working closely with tech companies, urging them to adopt stricter measures against the exploitation of vulnerable individuals on their platforms. Social media giants, once reluctant to take responsibility for the content and activity on their sites, were now pressured into taking a more active role in preventing the exploitation of their users. Working together with lawmakers, advocates, and survivors, tech companies began instituting policies that made it harder for traffickers to prey on vulnerable individuals. Australia's role in this digital age of trafficking was pivotal. In addition to the National Task Force, the Australian government began collaborating with international partners, setting up joint operations to monitor digital spaces and prevent online exploitation. The effort culminated in the creation of a new global framework for tracking and prosecuting online human trafficking, involving key players such as the United Nations, Interpol, and various non-governmental organizations. But even as these efforts began to make strides, the problem remained enormous. No one understood this more than the survivors who had lived through the horrors of Ben's operation. Despite the new laws, despite the international collaborations, they were all too aware that the fight was ongoing. They knew that as long as there were vulnerable people in the world, traffickers would find a way to exploit them. One particular case, that of a young woman named Nia, served as a stark reminder of just how far-reaching this battle was. Nia, a recent immigrant from the Philippines, had been lured to Australia under the false promise of a job in a beauty salon. Upon arrival, she was forced into servitude, her passport taken, and her life slowly destroyed in ways she couldn't have imagined. She had no friends, no family in Australia, and no way to escape. It wasn't until an undercover operation led by the Australian Federal Police that Nia was freed. Her case, however, was not unique. Thousands of women like Nia were still being exploited by traffickers every year. Even after the fall of Ben Thomas and his network, the demand for cheap, illegal labor, whether in the sex industry, construction, or agriculture, was still very much alive. Maria's foundation began to focus more on these high-risk individuals. Many victims were not just immigrants, but also those within Australia itself, often from marginalized communities, living on the fringes of society. The foundation expanded its efforts to target local at-risk populations and raise awareness within these communities. They provided education on how to spot trafficking, how to report it, and how to access the services they needed if they were ever in danger. The survivors of Ben's syndicate were not just part of the story of recovery, they were its central figures. Through their courage, their resilience, and their tireless advocacy, they had turned the page on one of the darkest chapters in Australian criminal history. But as the battle continued, they remained committed to the mission, to ensure that Ben's legacy was not one of fear, but of change. The survivors had taken what was once a nightmare and transformed it into the fuel for a global movement against trafficking and exploitation. In the years that followed, the world began to see a slow but steady decline in the prevalence of human trafficking. The ripple effect of the downfall of Ben Thomas and the survivors' continued efforts served as a reminder that while the fight was far from over, the world had made meaningful strides in its efforts to protect those most vulnerable. And for those who had lived through the horrors, the journey was not about erasing the past, but about creating a future where no one would have to suffer in silence again. Case 5. In the early 2000s, the United Kingdom found itself at the center of one of the most elaborate and sinister criminal enterprises ever uncovered. It was a conspiracy that spanned continents, weaving together the trafficking of drugs and human lives in a web so vast and intricate that even law enforcement officials were stunned by its sheer scope. At the heart of it all was a man named Edward Graves, a name that would become infamous in the annals of British crime. Edward Graves was a man of unassuming appearance. His carefully cultivated demeanor, a mixture of charisma and subtle menace, allowed him to operate in the shadows, manipulating both people and systems to serve his needs. To the public eye, he was a businessman, quiet, reserved, always well-dressed in a sharp suit. But beneath this facade, he was a kingpin in a network that dealt in both human misery and narcotics. He had the rare ability to blend into any setting, whether it was a high-profile business meeting or a dark alleyway where deals were made in whispers. Few knew of his darker dealings, and those who did often found themselves in perilous situations. Graves had come from humble beginnings in the outskirts of London. His early life, though marred by poverty and crime, had shaped him into someone who understood the vulnerability of people, an understanding he would later exploit for his own gain. In his youth, he had witnessed the destruction that drug addiction could bring, watching family members and friends spiral into oblivion. This early exposure, rather than deterring him from the world of crime, seemed to fuel his desire to control it. As he grew older, he realized that the real power lay in controlling both the drugs and the people who consumed them. By the mid-2000s, Graves had expanded his operations far beyond the streets of London. He had cultivated an intricate network that spanned the UK, with tentacles reaching into Europe and Asia. His connections to drug cartels in South America and Asia allowed him to move large quantities of narcotics across international borders with ease. Cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine were just some of the substances he trafficked, each one contributing to the vast fortune he was amassing. But Graves was not content with merely dealing drugs. His empire was built on the exploitation of people. The same networks that supplied him with narcotics also provided a steady stream of vulnerable individuals, many of whom were desperate immigrants, fleeing war-torn countries or oppressive regimes in search of a better life. These individuals were promised safety, work, and a new beginning in the UK. But what they found instead was a life of captivity and abuse. The trafficking operation was carefully orchestrated, with Graves at the helm, pulling the strings behind the scenes. His recruiters scoured impoverished regions, using promises of jobs and better opportunities to lure men, women, and children into his grasp. Once these individuals were smuggled into the UK, they were subjected to horrific conditions. Many were forced to work in brothels, others in sweatshops or on construction sites, while others were sold into domestic servitude. They were often kept in isolation, their passports taken, and their every move monitored by ruthless enforcers. Graves maintained an air of innocence, never getting directly involved in the day-to-day operations of trafficking, but always ensuring that everything ran smoothly. Graves' syndicate grew more sophisticated over time. He developed a network of corrupt officials, ranging from border security guards to immigration officers, who were paid handsomely to turn a blind eye to the influx of drugs and people crossing borders. He also enlisted a series of middlemen, individuals who would act as intermediaries between him and his criminal associates, further distancing himself from any direct involvement. This allowed him to maintain the illusion of legitimacy while continuing to expand his operations undetected. It wasn't until 2010 that authorities first began to piece together the enormity of Graves' empire. A routine investigation into drug trafficking had uncovered a small, seemingly insignificant lead, a tip-off about a shipment of heroin coming through one of the UK's major ports. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered something far darker, a complex network of human trafficking, with Graves at the center. What initially seemed like a drug case soon evolved into one of the most significant human trafficking investigations the UK had ever seen. The investigation revealed the full scale of the syndicate's operations. Graves' network extended to countries in Europe, where individuals were trafficked into the UK and sold into forced labor. It also stretched to Asia, where young women were recruited under false pretenses and shipped to the UK to work in the sex trade. The scale was staggering. Thousands of people had been exploited, and the drugs being trafficked were estimated to be worth billions of pounds. As the investigation unfolded, a picture began to emerge of the inner workings of the syndicate. Graves' operations were meticulously planned, with different aspects of the business being run by a network of trusted lieutenants. These lieutenants were responsible for different segments of the operation: recruiting, transportation, and distribution, each one playing a vital role in keeping the entire enterprise running smoothly. Graves himself remained largely in the background, making sure that no direct evidence could link him to the crimes. But his fingerprints were all over the operation. In 2011, the British authorities launched a series of coordinated raids across the country, aimed at dismantling Graves' network. The raids were conducted with military precision, and dozens of individuals were arrested, including some of Graves' closest associates. However, Graves himself remained elusive. He had gone underground, using his wealth and resources to cover his tracks. Despite this, the authorities were closing in. For months, Graves evaded capture, living under a series of false identities. He traveled extensively, constantly shifting locations, using fake passports and burner phones to communicate with his associates. But the pressure was mounting. Law enforcement agencies from across the globe had teamed up to track his movements, and the noose was slowly tightening around him. It was in the summer of 2012 that Graves' luck finally ran out. A tip-off from an informant led authorities to a small estate in the countryside, where Graves had been hiding under a false name. When law enforcement officers stormed the property, they found him alone, trying to flee in the dead of night. Graves was arrested without incident, his empire finally crumbling after years of careful planning and execution. The trial of Edward Graves was a media sensation. The details of his operation, spanning drugs, human trafficking, and corruption, captivated the public's imagination. The victims of his trafficking network came forward, telling harrowing stories of their exploitation and abuse. Many of them, now free, had to undergo years of therapy to recover from the physical and emotional scars left by their ordeal. In 2013, Graves was sentenced to life in prison, his empire officially dismantled. but the damage he had done could not be undone. The investigation into his network had revealed not just the scale of human trafficking, but also the corruption that allowed such a vast operation to thrive. It sparked an international conversation about the role of law enforcement, the importance of global cooperation, and the need to strengthen protections for vulnerable individuals. Edward Graves' story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how one man's thirst for power could destroy countless lives. And even though he was behind bars, the reverberations of his actions were felt long after the trial ended. The UK had paid a heavy price for his greed, but it had also learned valuable lessons in the fight against human trafficking and drug smuggling, lessons that would shape the future of law enforcement for years to come. As time went on, the victims of Graves' network slowly began to rebuild their lives, finding solace in the communities that supported them. They were no longer just statistics, they were survivors, and their stories would continue to be told, ensuring that the darkness of Edward Graves' empire would never be forgotten. The investigation into Edward Graves' empire had only just begun to unravel the magnitude of his criminal activities. While authorities had managed to dismantle a significant portion of his operation, the full scale of his network remained a mystery. It was clear that Graves' empire stretched beyond the shores of the United Kingdom, deeply embedded within the dark corners of international crime. What had initially been thought of as a large-scale drug operation was now understood to be part of something far more sinister, an intricate and devastating web of human exploitation that affected countless lives across the globe. Graves' ability to maintain a facade of innocence had been key to his success. For years, he had carefully cultivated relationships with key figures in both the legal and illegal sectors, ensuring that his operations continued to run without suspicion. He was known for his cold, calculating nature, always planning 2 or 3 steps ahead of his adversaries and managing to stay just out of reach of law enforcement. As the investigation into his activities unfolded, it became increasingly clear that Graves' reach went far beyond just drug smuggling and human trafficking. One of the most shocking discoveries was the involvement of corrupt government officials in several countries, some of whom had been on his payroll for years. These officials had turned a blind eye to the endless streams of drugs and people passing through borders, keeping the criminal syndicate functioning at full capacity. It was revealed that Graves had an entire infrastructure built to facilitate the smuggling of not just drugs, but human beings as well. He used fake businesses, shell companies, and corrupt officials to transport people across international borders. The journey of these victims often began in places where hope was scarce, war-torn regions in the Middle East, parts of Eastern Europe, and Africa. Graves' recruiters would prey on individuals desperate for a better life, promising them employment, safety, and opportunities in the United Kingdom. Once they were lured into the operation, the harsh reality was often far different. They were transported through a series of illegal channels, kept in secret locations for processing, and then either sold into the sex trade, forced into labor, or subjected to a life of servitude under threats of violence. It wasn't until the authorities began collaborating with international law enforcement agencies that the extent of the trafficking operation was truly revealed. A global network was uncovered, stretching across continents and involving individuals from various criminal organizations. However, what truly horrified investigators was the sheer number of innocent lives caught in the web of Graves' schemes. Thousands of men, women, and children had been exploited, and the full scope of the trafficking ring stretched far beyond anything they had anticipated. The heroin and cocaine that Graves smuggled into the UK were not merely financial assets for him, they were tools of control. The drugs were often distributed in impoverished areas of the UK, creating a cycle of addiction that was difficult to break. Graves knew that as long as people were desperate for their next fix, they would remain dependent on him and his empire. His network of dealers was vast, each one ensuring that the drugs continued to flow, keeping the streets of the UK awash in misery. But it was the human side of his operations that truly spoke to his monstrous character. He didn't just traffic in drugs, he trafficked in human suffering, turning people's lives into commodities to be bought and sold. As investigators continued to dig into the depths of Graves' empire, they began to uncover disturbing details about the lengths to which he had gone to protect himself and his network. Surveillance footage and wiretapped phone conversations revealed just how meticulous Graves was in maintaining the secrecy of his operations. He rarely, if ever, met directly with the people he worked with. Instead, he communicated through a network of intermediaries, ensuring that if one of them was caught or arrested, it wouldn't lead back to him. This careful planning made it incredibly difficult for authorities to gather enough evidence to arrest him. But as the investigation gained momentum, Graves' carefully constructed world began to crumble. One of his most trusted lieutenants, a man named Michael Hawk, had grown tired of living in the shadows. He had seen enough suffering, enough broken lives. As a member of Graves' inner circle, Hawk knew the intricacies of the organization like few others did. He had been involved in the recruitment process, helping to bring in victims from overseas, and he had seen firsthand the horrors they endured. His conscience, once dormant, began to stir, and he realized he could no longer be a part of such a monstrous enterprise. In the dead of night, Hawk made a decision that would change the course of the investigation. He reached out to law enforcement with crucial information, offering to testify against Graves in exchange for immunity. He knew the risks. Betraying Graves was a death sentence in the world they inhabited. But Hawk had reached a breaking point. The victims, the lives that had been destroyed, were too much for him to bear. And so, with trembling hands, he began to unravel the truth about Graves' operations, divulging everything he knew. With Hawk's cooperation, authorities were able to gain a much deeper understanding of the inner workings of the syndicate. They now had a roadmap to follow, tracing the flow of both drugs and humans from one end of the network to the other. The next few months saw a series of high-profile arrests and raids, each one bringing investigators closer to the heart of the operation. One by one, key players in Graves' empire were taken down, but still, the mastermind himself remained elusive. The investigation had now become a race against time. Law enforcement knew that if Graves wasn't caught soon, his network could regroup, re-establish itself, and continue its operations. For every arrest they made, it seemed like there were two more criminals waiting to take the place of the fallen. But as pressure mounted, Graves made a critical mistake. He underestimated the resolve of the authorities and the depth of their investigation. The detectives had come to understand his methods, how he stayed one step ahead by manipulating those around him, by keeping himself hidden behind a veil of intermediaries. They knew that in order to catch him, they had to sever those connections, dismantle the web that he had so carefully constructed. It wasn't until the spring of 2012 that Graves' empire began to collapse completely. The authorities had gathered enough evidence to conduct a series of coordinated raids across multiple locations in the UK. Graves had made the fatal error of getting too comfortable, believing that his network was too large and too powerful to be taken down. He had underestimated the tenacity of the law enforcement officers who had been tracking his every move. On a cool, overcast morning, armed officers stormed a private estate located in the outskirts of London, where Graves had been hiding. The estate, a sprawling mansion complete with high gates and extensive grounds, had become his sanctuary after months of evasion. It was there that Graves believed he would be safe from the authorities. But the operation was swift, and within minutes, the property was surrounded. Graves was apprehended without incident, his capture the culmination of years of investigation and painstaking work. It was a moment that brought both relief and heartbreak to those who had been fighting to bring him to justice. The victims of Graves' trafficking network were finally free, but the emotional scars they carried would last a lifetime. As Graves was led away in handcuffs, he seemed almost unbothered, his expression as cold and calculating as it had always been. For a man who had controlled so many lives, the moment of his capture was almost anticlimactic. He was placed in a holding cell, awaiting trial, but the world outside knew that his reign of terror had come to an end. The victims who had survived his empire were finally given a voice, their stories heard and acknowledged, and justice was on its way. The story of Edward Graves' downfall would not be a straightforward one. Despite the raids, the interrogations, and the growing mountain of evidence, his trial became an exercise in endurance. The defense team he managed to hire, many of them top-tier lawyers with years of experience in criminal law, tried to spin the story in a way that would keep him free. Graves had the resources to mount a defense that would outlast even the best of them. Throughout the trial, the defense team fought tooth and nail to discredit the evidence, often arguing that the testimonies of those who had worked for him, those who had been complicit in the crimes, were unreliable at best. They attempted to paint Graves as a businessman who had unknowingly become embroiled in criminal activities beyond his control. It was a tactic that often worked, especially with juries who were not intimately familiar with the underground world of drug cartels and human trafficking. But the truth was slowly emerging. Every day, the prosecution presented evidence, wiretap conversations, intercepted shipments, surveillance footage, and photographs painted a much darker picture of the man at the center of it all. The testimonies of survivors, people who had been rescued from Graves' trafficking operations, were the emotional cornerstone of the case. These were the people who had once been hopeless, their lives ruined by the false promises of a better future in the UK. They spoke of being locked in windowless rooms, starved, threatened with violence, and forced into degrading work that tore away at their dignity. Some of them had been smuggled into the UK as young children. Others had been trafficked for the sex trade. The horrors they described were heart-wrenching, but their voices were the ones that brought the case to life in the courtroom. Edward Graves' empire of suffering, however, was not just confined to the UK. As the investigation delved deeper into his operations, the world learned that his trafficking ring had spanned continents, each country a mere node in a global network designed to smuggle both drugs and people in vast numbers. He used seemingly legitimate businesses in one country to ship goods, including industrial equipment and agricultural products, which concealed his true operations. In one instance, a series of shipping containers filled with textiles was uncovered to be masking shipments of cocaine. At the same time, hidden amongst the cargo, several victims were found locked in cages, unable to escape. They were on their way to a future of exploitation in the UK. Investigators, with the help of international partners, were able to trace the origins of the network back to countries such as Poland, Nigeria, Albania, and even as far as Mexico and Cambodia. Graves had a deep connection with a variety of criminal syndicates across these regions, and his trafficking routes often mirrored global supply chains. The horror of these discoveries began to reveal the full extent of his operation. It became clear that the victims weren't just trafficked for sex work. Many were forced into bonded labor in illegal sweatshops, used in the production of counterfeit goods, and even forced into performing in illegal gambling rings. What made the operation so insidious was its scope. Graves' empire did not just exploit people in the traditional sense. He saw human beings as commodities, and to him, a human life was worth just as much as the drugs he smuggled into the country. It was a brutal calculation. In one of the most shocking revelations, the prosecution uncovered evidence that Graves had even organized training camps in remote parts of the UK, where new recruits were taught how to run drugs, evade authorities, and maintain the secrecy of his operation. These recruits, often young men and women, were stripped of their identities and forced to work for little to no pay, while being threatened with violence if they failed to comply with orders. As the trial proceeded, the defense team seemed to lose momentum. They could no longer deny the staggering weight of evidence. The testimonies of survivors and the mounting proof of Graves' involvement in the trafficking and drug trade were beginning to drown out any defense that had been offered. Even the most skilled lawyers couldn't prevent the truth from emerging. Graves, once an untouchable figure, was no longer able to keep the dark truth of his life hidden. The people in the courtroom watched as the realization of Graves' guilt became undeniable. The survivors, some of whom were now reunited with their families, sat in the front rows. They had come to bear witness, to tell their stories, and to help bring the man who had destroyed their lives to justice. Each of them had faced a future filled with unimaginable pain, and yet, there they were, standing tall as they fought for the victims who were still suffering in the shadows of Graves' empire. At the climax of the trial, as the prosecutor delivered the closing statements, it became evident that the only thing left for Graves to do was face the consequences of his actions. He could no longer hide behind his expensive lawyers or the web of intermediaries that had kept him insulated for so long. For the first time in years, he was forced to confront the reality of what he had done. As the judge prepared to deliver the verdict, the courtroom fell into an eerie silence. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for justice to be served. The fate of Edward Graves, a man who had once held the world in his grasp, was about to be sealed. The survivors, those who had escaped his clutches, those whose lives had been torn apart, watched intently, knowing that this was the moment they had fought for. It was not just about bringing down one man. It was about dismantling an entire system of exploitation and violence that had been allowed to flourish under the radar for far too long. The judge's voice broke through the silence, and the words were sharp, final. Edward Graves, you have been found guilty of multiple counts of human trafficking, drug smuggling, conspiracy, and exploitation. The evidence against you is overwhelming. You have destroyed countless lives for your own personal gain. You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. For a moment, It seemed as though the weight of those words was almost too much to bear for the survivors in the room. Some wept, others simply sat in stunned silence, as the final chapter in the long saga of Edward Graves was written. His empire, built on pain and suffering, had finally crumbled. The legal battle was over, but the true effects of Graves' crimes were far from finished. Thousands of lives had been destroyed, but for the first time in years, the survivors were beginning to reclaim their futures. They were rebuilding their lives, and though the scars of their past would never truly fade, they had gained something far more valuable, their freedom. As for Edward Graves, his fate had been sealed. But the shadows of his empire would continue to linger for years to come. The remnants of his operation were scattered across the world, and there would always be a fight to ensure that no one else would ever be caught in the web he had so ruthlessly spun. The story of Graves' downfall was not just the end of one man's criminal career. It was a testament to the power of those who refused to stay silent. It was a victory not just for law enforcement, but for the victims who had fought back, who had risen from the ashes of their suffering, and who had brought him to justice. As the years passed after Edward Graves' conviction, his story became a cautionary tale, one that resonated across not only the UK, but also the international community. It was a tale of ruthless ambition, cold indifference, and the horrifying consequences of unchecked greed. But more importantly, it was a story of survival, redemption, and the courage of those who had been silenced for far too long. While the world outside continued to turn, the survivors of Graves' empire found themselves on a slow, sometimes painful, road to recovery. Many of them faced significant challenges in adjusting to a life outside the trafficking system. After all, some had been trafficked for years, and for them, normalcy was a foreign concept. They had lived in constant fear, under the thumb of a man who had stripped away their dignity, their freedom, and their very sense of self. Now, with Graves imprisoned and his empire dismantled, they had to navigate the world as free individuals. But freedom, as many of them discovered, was not always the easy gift it seemed to be. For some, the scars of their past never truly healed. The trauma they had endured in the dark corners of Graves' network lingered, shadowing every aspect of their lives. Trust became a foreign word. Relationships were hard to form. The constant fear that they might be dragged back into the darkness, back into a world where they had no control, remained. Yet, for others, there was a glimmer of hope. As more victims came forward to share their stories and seek justice, they found solace in the community of survivors who banded together. They found strength in numbers, in the support of those who truly understood the depths of their pain. Support groups and rehabilitation programs, both in the UK and across Europe, became lifelines for those struggling to piece their lives back together. One of the most remarkable aspects of the recovery process was the way the survivors came to view their stories not just as tales of victimhood, but as symbols of resilience. Many of them chose to speak out publicly about their experiences, sharing their personal journeys in an effort to raise awareness about human trafficking. They wanted to ensure that Graves' story wouldn't be forgotten, but more importantly, they wanted to prevent others from falling victim to similar predators. Through documentaries, interviews, and public speeches, survivors became the faces of the fight against human trafficking. Their courage and determination to turn their pain into a message of hope were nothing short of inspiring. Their voices reached far beyond the courtroom, into the hearts and minds of people around the world. While the survivors fought to rebuild their lives, the authorities continued to monitor the remnants of Graves' network. His criminal empire, though shattered, still left behind a trail of chaos. Investigations continued, uncovering more links to drug cartels, organized crime syndicates, and corrupt government officials who had turned a blind eye to the horrors that had been happening right under their noses. Graves' influence, though diminished, was still felt in the darker corners of society, and the fight to eliminate his legacy would be a long and difficult one. The drug trafficking routes that Graves had once controlled were slowly being taken over by new players in the criminal underworld. The trade in illicit substances, particularly cocaine and heroin, remained a persistent issue for law enforcement. Graves had been a major figure in the UK's drug scene, and his arrest had sent shockwaves through the criminal world. But as often happens with criminal organizations, one leader's downfall led to a power vacuum that other criminals were eager to fill. The drugs that had once been smuggled through the ports were now finding new routes into the UK, and the battle to stem the flow of narcotics was far from over. However, the UK government, along with international law enforcement agencies, was resolute in their mission to dismantle the remaining aspects of Graves' operation. They began to target the middlemen, the ones who had carried out his orders in the shadows. These were the people who had run the illegal sweatshops, smuggled the victims, and transported the drugs. Without Graves' central command, many of them were left scrambling, and several key players were arrested over the course of the following years. In the midst of these developments, Clara and a group of fellow survivors founded a non-profit organization called Reclaiming Freedom. Their mission was clear: to provide long-term support to victims, raise awareness about modern-day trafficking, and offer resources for those who had been freed but struggled to reintegrate into society. They knew firsthand that the road to recovery was long and filled with obstacles. It wasn't just about getting people out of captivity. It was about empowering them to rebuild their lives. Clara's personal journey was a testament to the strength of human resilience. She had not only survived unimaginable abuse and exploitation, but she had managed to transform her pain into something that could change lives. Her non-profit organization quickly gained traction, attracting the attention of philanthropists, lawmakers, and other organizations dedicated to fighting trafficking. Clara's advocacy work extended beyond the UK. She spoke at international conferences, worked with global NGOs, and even consulted with governments in Europe and Asia, sharing her knowledge and experience to improve anti-trafficking policies around the world. The survivors of Graves' Empire formed a close-knit group, united by their shared experiences and their desire to see justice prevail. They met regularly, both in person and online, to share their stories, offer support, and strategize about ways to continue their advocacy work. For many, these gatherings were a lifeline, places where they could openly discuss the trauma they had experienced without fear of judgment or misunderstanding. These meetings were a testament to the strength of the human spirit, to the enduring will to fight for justice, even when it felt like the world was against them. Years later, as the efforts to eradicate trafficking continued to grow in both scope and intensity, Clara found herself at a crossroads. She had spent so much time advocating for others, working tirelessly to shine a light on the dark corners of the world, that she hadn't fully addressed her own healing. While her advocacy work was vital, she knew that her personal journey was just as important. In a quiet moment of reflection, Clara decided to take a step back from the public eye for a while. She needed time to process everything she had lived through, to heal on a deeper level. During this period of self-reflection, Clara took a break from the media and focused on her mental and emotional well-being. She sought therapy, attended support groups for survivors, and spent more time with her loved ones. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to focus on the simple joys of life, the things that had been taken from her during her years of captivity. It was in this time of personal healing that Clara realized just how far she had come. The young woman who had once been a victim, trapped in a world of darkness and abuse, had become a global advocate for change. Her transformation was nothing short of extraordinary, and her story would continue to inspire future generations of survivors. And so, as time passed and the fight against trafficking carried on, Clara and her fellow survivors remained at the forefront of the battle. They had lived through hell, but they had emerged victorious. They had found their freedom, and they were using it to create a world where others could one day escape the same fate. Their voices, once silenced, now rang out in powerful unison, demanding justice, compassion, and a future free from exploitation. But the journey was far from over. The fight for justice, the battle against trafficking, would continue until the day came when no one else had to suffer as they had. The survivors of Graves' Empire were proof that even the darkest stories could be rewritten, that even the most broken lives could be mended. Their victory was not just their own. It was a victory for all those who still waited for their chance to be free.